The first explosion took out every window on the trauma floor. The second killed the power, and somewhere beneath 40 feet of smoke and collapsed concrete, a young woman was bleeding internally from a wound that had been documented, flagged, and deliberately ignored 3 hours before the building came apart. The nurse who had caught it was already gone, suspended, badge stripped, escorted to the parking lot by security, while the doctor who dismissed her signed the paperwork with one hand and adjusted his cufflinks with the other. Then the ceiling caved in, and suddenly nobody knew what to do without her. If you're new here, hit subscribe and stay until the end, because this story is going to take you somewhere you did not see coming. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night shift at Harlow Memorial Medical Center started the way most nights started in Crestfall, Wyoming quiet in the way that made experienced nurses nervous. It was the kind of quiet that had weight to it. Pressure behind the eyes. The sensation of something held just slightly too tight. Mara Calloway had worked trauma nursing for 6 years at Harlow, and she had learned to read that silence the way some people read weather. Not from data, from the air itself. She was 32 years old, 5'6", and had the kind of face that people consistently underestimated, not because it lacked intelligence, but because it rarely advertised it. She kept her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, wore her scrubs a half size too large, because she'd bought them during a period when she was carrying more weight and never got around to replacing them, and moved through the halls of Harlow's trauma unit with the kind of economy that came from years of being the person in the room who had to carry the most while making the least noise about it. She wasn't the kind of nurse who made speeches. She wasn't the kind who made demands. She asked questions, documented everything, and had been written up twice in the past year for what her personnel file described as failure to defer to attending physician judgment in non-emergency situations. Both write-ups had come from the same man. Dr. Marcus Holt, director of trauma services at Harlow Memorial, had been running the unit for 11 years. He was talented, genuinely, undeniably talented, and he knew it the way people know a thing when they've been told it often enough that it stops being information and becomes identity. He was 54, broad through the shoulders, silver-haired, with a voice that projected easily across a crowded trauma bay, and a handshake that always lasted a half second too long. He treated competent nurses the way some men treat good weather as background. Expected, unremarkable. He treated nurses who questioned him differently. Mara had learned that distinction slowly, then all at once, the way most hard lessons arrived. The patient came in at 9:47 p.m. Sadie Wentworth, 26 years old, brought by private ambulance after a collision on the interstate 8 miles east of Crestfall. The report said her SUV had drifted across the center line and struck a concrete barrier at highway speed. Airbags deployed, seatbelt worn. Vitals at the scene had been stable enough to transport. Sadie was conscious when they rolled her in, which was the part that made things complicated. She could answer questions. She was pale and shaken, and her right forearm had a laceration that needed suturing, and there was bruising across her sternum from the seatbelt. But she was talking, and she was calm, and she said she felt okay, and that was the part that Mara didn't trust for even 1 second. She had seen this before. The ones who came in talking clearly, vitals holding in acceptable range. Nothing screaming, those were the ones you had to watch. Because sometimes what looked like stability was actually the body borrowing time it didn't have. Mara documented everything she observed during intake. The pallor, the slightly elevated heart rate that was being attributed to shock and anxiety. The way Sadie's abdomen was tense when Mara ran a gentle hand across it during assessment, not rigid, not board-like, but guarded. Not the way muscles guard against pain, the way they guard against something deeper. She flagged it in the chart, then she found Holt. He was coming out of Trauma 2, peeling off gloves, already moving toward the attending station with the posture of a man who had decided his night was winding down. Dr. Holt. Mara kept pace with him. The Wentworth patient in Bay 4, I want to flag something on intake. He didn't stop walking. What's her pressure? 118/74. Pulse? 91. That's anxiety from the accident. Her abdomen is guarded, Mara said. Not obviously rigid, but there's resistance on palpation. She hit a concrete barrier at highway speed, and the seat belt would have. Calloway. He stopped at the station, turned to face her with the specific expression she had catalogued over 2 years. Patience. Performed. The face of a man waiting for a subordinate to finish saying something he'd already was wrong. She's stable. She's talking. I'll order a chest x-ray. We'll suture the arm, and if her pressure drops, we reassess. That's the protocol. I'm recommending we get CT imaging of the abdomen. I heard your recommendation. The mechanism of injury is consistent with a seatbelt contusion. He turned back to the station, which she has. Document your concern. I'll review the x-ray when it comes back. Mara stood there for a moment. There was a version of this interaction she had played out in her head many times. The version where she pushed harder, where she escalated to the attending on call, where she found the exact combination of words that made someone listen. She had been searching for that combination for 2 years. Document it clearly, she said, and went back to Bay 4. Sadie Wentworth was trying to text someone on her phone, holding it in her left hand because her right arm was immobilized for suturing prep. She looked up when Mara came back. Am I going to be here long? We're getting some imaging done, Mara said. How's your pain level? 6 maybe. Mostly my chest where the seatbelt caught. Any shoulder pain, especially left shoulder? Sadie thought about it. A little. Is that bad? It means your body is doing what it's supposed to do, Mara said, which was true, without being an answer to the actual question. Who are you texting? My dad. He worries. Give him the hospital number and tell him to call the front desk. They can give him an update. Sadie looked at her. You're being really calm about this. That's my job. Are you worried about me? Mara held the girl's gaze. I'm going to make sure you're looked after. She went back to the chart and added a second notation. Detailed. Specific. The time, the findings, the recommendation for cross-sectional imaging, the response from the attending physician. She had learned from the first write-up that documentation was the only weapon she reliably had access to, and she used it the way a careful person uses the last of something they know they can't replace. Then the charge nurse called her to Bay 7. She went because there were 6 other patients on the floor, and the night was not interested in waiting for her to finish worrying. She was resetting an IV line in Bay 7 when she heard the change in Sadie's monitor. The tone shifted, not the alarm yet, just the subtle acceleration of a rhythm climbing past where it should be. Mara was already moving before the number registered on the station board. 98, 102. Heart rate climbing steadily in the way that meant the body was compensating for something it was losing. She got to Bay 4 and found Sadie still conscious, but different paler. Somehow, the color having drained from her face in the minutes Mara had been gone. Her breathing was shallower. She had stopped texting. Something feels wrong, Sadie said. I know. Mara was already on the call button. I've got you. Her pressure had dropped to 94/60. Mara called it out to the floor and reached for the crash cart. She started a second large bore IV line without waiting for orders, because the time for waiting had passed several minutes ago, and she knew it, and if Holt wanted to write her up for it, she would deal with that later. Holt arrived 90 seconds after the alert. He took one look at the monitor, at Sadie's color, at the numbers, and something shifted in his face, a tightening around the eyes that Mara recognized as the moment a person realizes they miscalculated. Get imaging on standby, he said. Now. I flagged an abdominal bleed at intake, Mara says, not loudly, just clearly. Not the time, Calloway. I flagged it twice. Holt rounded on her with a controlled fury that was worse than shouting, the kind of anger that had learned to wear professional clothes. You want to have this conversation right now? While my patient is in distress. I want to make sure the team knows what I documented, so we're all treating the right thing. Get out of this bay, he said. Dr. Holt security. He raised his voice without taking his eyes off her. I need security to escort Nurse Calloway to the administrative office. Right now. For a moment, the bay was absolutely still. The other nurses looked at the floor. The tech near the crash cart studied something on the wall. Sadie Wentworth looked at Mara from the bed with an expression that was almost an apology. I'll be okay, Sadie said quietly. Mara looked at the girl, at the monitor, at Holt, who was already turning away, already issuing orders to the team around her, as if she had ceased to exist. Keep her pressure up, Mara said, to no one in particular. She needs at least 2 units of O-neg until you know her type. Then security arrived, and she left. She was escorted to the administrative office on the 2nd floor, which was empty at this hour, and a night shift administrator she had never met handed her a printed suspension notice that had clearly been prepared in advance. The template was already filled in, the language boilerplate, only her name and the date typed fresh into the designated fields. Holt had started the paperwork before the shift had even ended. He had been ready for this. She signed where they told her to sign. She removed her badge. She walked to her locker, changed out of her scrubs into the jeans and fleece she'd worn in from the parking structure, and stood for a moment in front of her locker with her hands flat on the cold metal. She had 18 years of training and experience, and nobody in that building was going to listen to a word of it. She closed the locker. She walked toward the exit. She was in the stairwell between the 2nd and 1st floors when the building moved. Not violently, not at first. A deep structural shudder that traveled up through the concrete stairs and into the soles of her feet like a sound below the threshold of hearing, the kind of vibration that the body registers before the brain does. Mara stopped walking. Her hand found the railing. Then the 2nd impact came, and this one had sound attached to it, a percussive, concussive blast that rolled through the building like a pressure wave, the kind of force that doesn't announce itself so much as arrive. The lights in the stairwell flickered and went out. Emergency lighting kicked on a half-second later, bathing everything in a flat industrial red that made the walls look like the inside of something living. From somewhere below, from the direction of the mechanical room, adjacent to the east wings, she heard the secondary explosion. Mara stood in the red-lit stairwell and understood immediately the way people who have been in certain situations understand things, not through analysis, but through something older and more physical than thought. The hospital was compromised. She went back up. By the time she hit the 2nd floor landing, she could smell smoke acrid and chemical, not fire smoke, but the specific smells of burning electrical systems. The kind that meant infrastructure, not accident. The hallway beyond the stairwell door was already filling with the low gray haze that preceded real visibility problems, and staff were moving through it with the particular controlled panic of people who were trained for emergencies, but who had never been inside one this large. What happened? She asked the first person she passed, a respiratory tech she recognized named Garza. Tanker, they're saying. Something on the service road hit the generator complex. Garza was moving and talking at the same time. East wing is I don't know. They're saying part of the structure came down. How much of the east wing? The corridor off Trauma 3. Mara stopped. Trauma 3. That was the overflow unit. That was where they moved patients from the main bays when the floor was running at capacity. She turned and looked back toward the administrative office she had come from. Her badge was gone. Her suspension notice was in the administrator's file. She had no access, no authority, no standing inside this building. She thought about Sadie Wentworth. She thought about the 2nd notation she'd made in the chart. Then she stopped thinking about authority and started moving. The main trauma floor looked like a version of itself, seen through a broken mirror, recognizable in its basic shape, but wrong in every specific. Monitors screamed. Beds had been displaced by evacuating staff. 3 patients were in the hallway already, some on gurneys. One in a wheelchair, being pushed by a crying LPN who couldn't have been more than 6 months out of school. The sprinkler system had activated in 2 sections, but not the third, which meant part of the floor was being drenched and part was not. And the inconsistency created the particular chaos of a system that was doing something without doing it completely. Mara found the charge nurse, Priya Okonkwo, in the center of the corridor, holding a radio that wasn't connecting. Priya. Mara grabbed her arm. "What's your head count? Who's unaccounted for?" Priya stared at her. "You're suspended." "I know. Who's missing?" A beat. Priya made the calculation that people make when the situation has outgrown the rules that were supposed to govern it. 3 patients in Trauma 3. Staff got 2 of them out. 1 is still the corridor collapsed. We can't get through. Which patient? Priya checked her clipboard. Wentworth. Bay 9, they moved her when Mara was already walking. The corridor to Trauma 3 had buckled at the midpoint. A section of ceiling had come down. Not catastrophically, the building was still standing. The structure was compromised, but not collapsed in the full sense, but enough to make the passage, say, impassable by conventional movement. Debris blocked the floor in a irregular pile of drywall and insulation and bent ductwork that reached chest height at its worst point. The smoke here was thicker. The emergency lighting was intermittent, clicking on and off in a rhythm that had nothing to do with pattern. 2 firefighters were at the entrance to the corridor. "You can't go through," the one on the left said, not unkindly. "Structural assessment isn't done. We don't know what else is going to come down. There's a patient with a suspected arterial bleed on the other side of that," Mara said. "Ma'am, we're aware. We're working on an entry route." "How long?" The firefighters looked at each other. "We need our structural team to clear it." "How long?" The one on the right said, 30 minutes, maybe 45 if. Mara had already stopped listening. She looked at the corridor, at the debris, at the specific shape of the collapse, the way the pile was highest in the center, but tapered toward the left side, where the wall met what had been a maintenance access panel. She tracked the geometry of it, the way someone follows a line on a map, calculating angle and clearance, and whether the thing she was looking at was actually impossible, or only looked that way from a distance. It looked manageable, not safe. Manageable. She pulled her fleece over her head and tied it around the lower half of her face. "Hey," the firefighter started. Mara stepped into the corridor. She moved low and fast, keeping her center of gravity below the unstable sections of the ceiling, testing each piece of debris before she committed weight to it, working toward the left wall where the clearance was widest. Chunks of drywall shifted under her hands. Something warm dripped on her shoulder from above. Not water, something the color of rust. She didn't look up. She was through the worst of it in 90 seconds. The smoke on the other side was heavier. Trauma 3's emergency lights were fully out. Only the ambient glow from a secondary hall connected to the unit gave any illumination at all, a dim gray light that made shapes visible without making them specific. Mara moved through the unit, calling out, low and steady, "Sadie." "Sadie Wentworth. My name is Mara. I'm coming to you." From the far bay, something. A sound that was not a word, but was intentional. Mara found her in Bay 9. Sadie was conscious. Barely. Her face was wrong, the color of old paper, sweat-soaked, eyes half open, but tracking when Mara knelt beside her. The monitor she'd been connected to had gone dark, its power cut with everything else. The IV line was still in, but the bag had been knocked loose in the initial blast and was empty, the line running dry. "Hey," Mara put her hand on Sadie's face. "I've got you." "Knew you'd come back," Sadie said, and her voice was a thread. "Weird thing to know. Not that weird." Mara was assessing fast hands running the abdomen with gentle pressure, checking Sadie's fingernail beds, feeling for the quality of her pulse. It was there but weak, and the rhythm of it told a story she didn't want to hear. I need you to stay very still. Don't try to sit up. Something is really wrong. I know. I've known for a couple hours. But I've got you now, so you need to stay with me. My shoulder hurts more, Sadie said. Left shoulder. That's actually a good sign in a weird way, Mara said. Means you're still feeling things. Stay with it. She took stock of what she had. Bay 9 was a full trauma setup, or had been, before the power went. Even without electricity, the physical supplies were here. Saline bags, pressure dressings, the IV supplies she needed to restart a line. She worked by the gray ambient light filtering from the hall, moving quickly and precisely, resetting the IV, running a fresh bag of saline wide open to buy time. She applied manual pressure to Sadie's abdomen with one hand and talked to her continuously while she did it, not reassurance. Exactly. But the kind of steady verbal contact that kept a person's brain anchored to the present moment, rather than sliding toward the dark. Tell me about your dad, Mara said. You said he worries. He's retired. Navy. Sadie's voice was faint, but she was working to answer, which was what Mara needed. He was an admiral. He's going to be out of his mind when he's going to see you walk out of here. You can't promise that. No, Mara agreed. But I can promise I'm not leaving you here. Those two things are related. Something shifted in the ceiling above them. A groan of stressed metal, not immediate, but not nothing. Morris looked up and saw a section of ductwork that had partially separated from its mounting, hanging at an angle that suggested it had decided to come down and had simply not finished making up its mind. She needed to move Sadie. Not far. Not out. She couldn't get her through the debris in this condition. But out from under that ductwork into the more structurally stable section of the unit toward the interior wall. I'm going to move you, Mara said. It's going to hurt. It already hurts. More, I mean. Sadie looked at her. Okay. The evacuation board was in the supply closet, 8 feet away. Mara had it in 30 seconds, came back, positioned it alongside Sadie's bed. She talked through every movement before she made it. She was methodical, and she was fast, and she was careful in the way you are careful when careless is not an option. And when Sadie made a sound of pain that came from somewhere deep and involuntary, Mara said, I know, stay with me, almost there, and she meant it. She got Sadie onto the board. She got the board to the interior wall. She crouched beside her and checked her pulse again, and watched the faint rise and fall of her chest, and listened to the buildings settle around them in the dark. Then she heard voices beyond the debris. The firefighters had gotten partial clearance. Freundin were trying to extend it, calling through to see if anyone was still alive on the other side. Mara raised her voice. 2 people here. 1 patient. Critical. I need a route out, and I need it as fast as you can make it. A pause. Then who's in there? Mara Calloway. Another pause. Are you a nurse? Yes. Is the patient? She's breathing. She's stable-ish. She's not going to stay that way, so please move faster. From somewhere above the main trauma floor from outside the building, the sound that cut through everything else, the deep percussive thud of helicopter rotors. Not one. Several. Military. The rhythm was wrong for news or medevac. Too low, too heavy, too many. Sadie had heard it too. Even in her condition, even with her eyes half closed, her chin tilted upward. That's she started. I hear it, Mara said. Those are military helicopters. I know, Sadie swallowed. My dad. Mara looked toward the ceiling, as if she could see through it to whatever was descending on the parking structure outside. The sound intensified, not 1 or 2 helicopters, but a coordinated arrival, the kind that meant a response had been organized somewhere above the local level, that someone with reach had made a call. Through the debris behind her, the firefighters were still working. The clearance was getting closer. She could hear it in the changing echo of their tools, the way the sound was less muffled, the gap between them narrowing. Sadie's hand found Mara's wrist. Don't let go, she said. I'm right here. Then the debris shifted not from the firefighter's side. From above, the ductwork that had been hanging at its angle made its decision, and when it came down fast, and the sound it made when it hit the floor of Bay 9 was enormous in the small space, and Sadie cried out, and Mara threw herself across the girl's upper body with her arms over Sadie's head. And then it was quiet. Mara lifted her head. Dust. The metallic taste of something in the air that she couldn't name. The ductwork had come down 3 feet to the left of where she had moved Sadie. The interior wall had held. She looked at Sadie. Sadie was staring at her. "You didn't let go," Sadie said. Mara sat up slowly. Her hands were shaking not from fear, exactly, but from the specific physiological response to a very close thing. The body processing danger after the fact in the way it always did, regardless of whether you wanted it to. "I told you I wouldn't." From beyond the debris, a voice cut through clearly. For the first time close now, the firefighters almost through. "We've got movement in the corridor. We're about 40 seconds out." And then, from somewhere outside this unit, from somewhere deeper in the building, a different voice. Commanding, controlled. The voice of someone who moved through emergencies without losing their footing in them. Calloway. Mara went still. She hadn't heard her name said that way in a long time. Not Nurse Calloway, just Calloway. The way people say a name when they already know everything attached to it. She turned toward the sound. Standing at the unit entrance, having come through from a secondary access she hadn't located, was a woman in military field gear dark uniform, no insignia visible in this light. Moving with the kind of deliberate economy that said she had been in compromised structures before, afraid of this one, and was not afraid of this one. The woman looked at Mara, then at Sadie, then at the fallen ductwork, 3 feet from where Sadie lay. "Situation?" the woman said. Mara's voice came out steadier than she expected. "One patient, suspected internal arterial bleed, compensating but declining. We need a surgical route, and we need it now." The military officer nodded once, pulled a radio, started talking into it in the clipped shorthand of someone who had been trained for exactly this mass casualty, compromised, structure, time-critical extraction. And then she looked at Mara again. Took in the civilian clothes. The hospital ID slot on her lanyard, empty, the badge gone. "You're the one who flagged the bleed at intake," the officer said. Not a question. Mara said yes, before the explosion. 2 hours before, something moved through the officer's face. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. They suspended you for it. It wasn't a question either. Through the gap in the debris, the firefighters were through. Light spilled into the unit from flashlights and tactical lamps, and the cavalry was arriving in both senses of the word, because Mara could now hear boots in the main trauma corridor, military voices coordinating with hospital staff, a level of organized response that hadn't existed 20 minutes ago. And from the entrance of the trauma floor in the middle of all of it, came a man who walked like he was used to being the last thing standing. He was tall, silver at the temples, wearing civilian clothes that somehow still looked like a uniform. He stopped at the entrance to Trauma 3 and looked through the cleared debris to where his daughter lay on an evacuation board with a civilian nurse crouching beside her. Sadie's eyes found him. "Dad," she said, small, exhausted. He crossed the debris without hesitating, knelt on the other side of the board from Mara, put his hand against his daughter's face with a gentleness that was completely at odds with everything about the way he'd entered the room. "I've got you," he said. "She found me," he said. She came back. The man looked up at Mara. His eyes were sharp and specific in the way of someone trained to assess a person quickly and not waste time on what the assessment reveals. "You're the nurse," he said. "I'm the suspended nurse," Mara said. Something moved behind his eyes. The military officer with the radio crouched beside him and said something low into his ear, and his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of a man receiving good news, but in the way of a man receiving information that confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. He looked at Mara. "What's your full name?" "Mara Calloway." He repeated it to the officer, who nodded. Then the officer said, "Calloway, before you came to Harlow, where did you serve?" The word serve landed in the smoky air between them. Mara looked at the officer, at the Admiral, at Sadie, who had closed her eyes but was still breathing steadily, blessedly, still breathing. She had kept this part of her life behind a door for a long time. Not from shame. From a decision she had made quietly, the way she made most decisions, about what parts of herself she brought into which rooms. Outside, the helicopters were still running. She could hear them through the walls, the engines cycling, the crews working, the machinery of a large military response that someone had activated in a very short period of time. Someone with the kind of reach that a retired Navy Admiral might have if his daughter's name had come across the wrong kind of emergency report. She looked at the man across from her. "I served 8 years as a Navy corpsman," she said. "Special operations attached. 3 deployments." The Admiral was very still. "You were field medicine," he said. "Mass casualty. Extraction, under fire. Compromised structures." She looked at the debris behind her. "I've been in worse rooms than this one." The officer with the radio was staring at her now with an expression she couldn't fully read in the low light. From the main corridor, someone was calling a voice that she recognized even through the commotion, even through the smoke and the distance. Holt, still trying to direct a situation that had outgrown him. The Admiral heard it too. He looked toward the sound. "That's the doctor who suspended her," Sadie said from the board, her eyes still closed, her voice barely above a whisper. Before the explosion. He didn't listen. The Admiral looked at his daughter, at Mara, at the empty lanyard where her badge had been. "But you came back," he said. Mara looked at Sadie, at the steady rise and fall of her chest, at the IV line running clear, and the pulse still present, still fighting, still doing what she needed it to do. "She wasn't done yet," Mara said. Then the stretcher team arrived from the military unit, and things began to move, and in the organized, controlled chaos of Sadie Wentworth being prepared for emergency transport, nobody noticed exactly when Mara stood up and stepped back. Nobody noticed the scar that ran across the back of her left shoulder when her sleeve shifted, the old one, pale and clean now, the kind that took years to fade to that color. Nobody noticed the way the military officer had gone quiet while looking at her. Nobody noticed any of it. But across the debris field, across the ruined corridor, through the smoky chaos of a hospital that was still trying to understand what it had survived, Doctor. Marcus Holt finally made it to the entrance of Trauma 3. He saw the Admiral. He saw his daughter on the evacuation board. He saw Mara. He stood there with the specific expression of a man who had prepared for one kind of conversation and found himself standing at the edge of a completely different one, for which he had no prepared remarks, no rehearsed deflections, no document already waiting in a file, with her name typed into the appropriate field. Mara met his eyes across the room. She said nothing. She didn't need to. In the corner of the unit, the military officer was on her radio again, her voice too low to carry. But once, in the middle of a transmission, she glanced at Mara, with the look of someone locating a thing they had not expected to find. And she said one word into the radio. A rank, a specific rank. Not nurse, not Calloway, something else entirely. Something that hung in the air of the ruined trauma unit like a question that had been waiting years to be asked, out loud. The word the officer said into the radio was petty, not a description, a rank prefix. As in petty officer, the specific designation that preceded the grade she had held when she left the Navy, the grade that was attached to 8 years of service records, that Mara had never mentioned a single at Harlow Memorial Medical Center, not during her hiring interview, not during the 2 years she had worked the trauma floor, not once. The officer's name tape read Solano. She was younger than Mara by maybe 4 years. But she moved through the ruined unit with the particular assurance of someone who had been in more than a few compromised buildings and had developed opinions about which ones were going to stay up. She finished her transmission, clipped the radio to her vest, and looked at Mara with an expression that was not quite recognition, but was in the neighborhood of it. "You served under Commander Brace," Solano said. It wasn't a question. "Third deployment, Coast Province." Mara looked at her steadily. "You weren't there." "No, but I know people who were." Solano paused. They talked about the corpsman, who kept Marines alive in a collapsed structure for 6 hours until extraction was possible. Said she did it with 2 IV bags, a tourniquet, and a headlamp with dying batteries. People exaggerate. They said she was also insufferable about documentation. Something moved across Mara's face that was not quite a smile. That part is probably accurate. The stretcher team was loading Sadie now, working efficiently, the 2 military medics running through their assessment with the fluency of people who had practiced it until it became reflex. The Admiral had moved aside to let them work, which told Mara something about him that even in this moment, with his daughter on that board, he understood that the people doing the job needed room to do it. Holt had not moved from the entrance of Trauma 3. He was watching the military medics work with the expression of a man trying to locate the moment in the evening where he had lost control of the situation, as if finding it would give him some leverage over what came next. He was still wearing his attending lanyard. He still had his badge. He had all the credentials that Mara no longer had, and none of the things that had actually mattered in the last 40 minutes. "Calloway." Solano's voice brought her back. "We need you on the floor." "I'm suspended." "Not by us." Mara looked at her. "That's not how hospital authority works." "No," Solano agreed. "But it is how mass casualty response works, which is what this is now. Your administration declared a mass casualty event 11 minutes ago, which triggers federal emergency medical protocols. Under those protocols, our response unit has co-authority over triage and treatment decisions for the duration of the event." She held Mara's gaze. "So I'm asking you, as the ranking medical coordinator of this response unit, to come with me." "A beat," Mara said. "You need me to say yes. I need you to say yes." Behind them, Sadie's stretcher began to move. The Admiral fell in beside it. He paused once as he passed Mara, stopped for just a moment, and said nothing. Just looked at her with eyes that held too many things for the moment to contain. Then he kept moving, because his daughter needed him moving. Mara pulled her fleece back on. Her hands had stopped shaking. She didn't know exactly when that had happened. "Okay," she said. "Show me what you've got." What she had was bad, and it was getting worse. The mass casualty count had climbed to 63 by the time Mara reached the main lobby, which Solano's team had begun converting into a secondary triage zone, while the ER proper remained active but overwhelmed. The tanker impact had damaged the generator complex but not destroyed it entirely, which meant Harlow was running on partial power, enough for the ER and the operating suites and the critical care unit, not enough for the secondary wings. The east corridor remained structurally compromised. 3 elevators were offline. The stairwells were passable but crowded. What Mara saw when she came into the lobby was a version of controlled chaos that was tilting toward the uncontrolled end of that spectrum. Solano's medics were skilled and organized, but they were 6 people handling a floor that needed 20. The hospital nursing staff was distributed across too many competing priorities, evacuating patients from the dark wings, managing the ER overflow, trying to keep communication open on radio channels that were already saturated. And in the middle of it, Mara could see the exact shape of what was missing. Not personnel, not equipment, structure. Nobody was running the sorting function. People were being treated in the order they were found, rather than the order they would die, which was a natural human instinct and a terrible mass casualty strategy. She could see 3 people who needed immediate surgical intervention sitting in the same holding area as a man with a broken wrist who was, by the volume and persistence of his complaints, clearly going to survive. She found the hospital's charge supervisor, a man named Decker, for 2 years. A man named Decker she had worked with for 2 years, standing near the main entrance with a clipboard that he was gripping the way drowning. People grip things that are not life preservers. Decker. She put herself in front of him. I need you to look at me. He looked at her. He looked past her badge slot, which was empty, with the reflexive discomfort of a person who followed rules, because rules were the structure that kept things predictable. Then he looked at the lobby, then back at her. You're suspended, he said, but his voice made it a question. Federal mass casualty protocol supersedes hospital suspension, she said, which was true, and which Solano had just told her, and which she was going to use for as long as it remained useful. I need the lobby, I need a sorting system, and I need it running in the next 3 minutes. Will you help me or not? Decker looked at the lobby again. At the man with the broken wrist yelling. At the 3 people who needed surgery sitting quietly in the wrong place. What do you need? He said. She moved them. It was not graceful. It was not the kind of triage that would be held up in a training video as exemplary. Mara made fast calls on incomplete information, worked by visual assessment and pulse and pupil response, and the particular quality of a person's color in bad lighting. And she was wrong about 2 things early on and had to adjust, which she did without drama. She organized the lobby into zones using gurneys and chairs, and in one section, the repurposed folding tables from the hospital gift shop, which Decker produced from somewhere with the resourcefulness of a man who had worked hospital logistics for 15 years. Solano's medics slotted into the system as if they had designed it themselves, which was the most useful thing about working with military medical teams. They were trained to adapt to someone else's organizational framework mid-operation, to subordinate their individual preferences to the structure that was already running. One of them, a compact woman named Graves, took over the intermediate zone without being asked and managed it with a quiet efficiency that Mara recognized as the same instinct that had brought her back through that debris field 40 minutes ago. The immediate zone was the hard one. 2 patients needed thoracic intervention that the hospital's single functioning oar could not provide simultaneously. A third had a head injury that was progressing faster than she'd want. Mara worked the room in a circuit, checking each critical patient every few minutes, adjusting, communicating with the ER team by radio when the channel was clear, and by a runner named Pham when it wasn't. She was managing the rotation on her 3rd circuit when Holt found her. He came across the lobby with a deliberate stride that was meant to project authority and managed instead to project a man trying to remember what authority felt like. He had 2 nurses with him, which Mara noticed and filed. He had brought backup, which meant he had already decided this was going to be a confrontation and had thought about optics. Calloway. His voice carried the command register he used in the trauma bay, the one that expected rooms to quiet around it. You need to stop what you're doing. Mara was checking the pulse on the head injury patient. She did not stop. I have the authority to have you removed from this building, Holt said. Under normal circumstances, Mara said, yes, these aren't normal circumstances. Solano, can you tell him? Solano was 6 feet away and did not look up from the IV she was running. Federal MCI protocol, Dr. Holt. Harlow declared mass casualty at 22:17. Our unit has co-authority for the duration. She glanced up. That includes personnel decisions in the triage zones. Holt looked at Solano, at the military insignia, at the radio on her vest. Something happened behind his eyes that was the private experience of a man whose framework for the evening was being revised in real time. This is my department, he said. And I'm glad it's here, Solano said, returning to her IV. We need every hand. He turned back to Mara. You are not going to make me look incompetent in my own hospital, he said, low, now, the volume of a private conversation. Mara finished her assessment of the head injury patient and straightened up. She looked at Holt, at the two nurses he'd brought with him, who were both looking at the floor with the specific posture of people who would prefer to be somewhere else. "Then stop acting incompetent," she said quietly. "I have 3 critical patients in this zone, and I need a surgeon for 2 of them. Tell me which surgical team is free, and I'll stop talking to you." His jaw tightened. "Surgical is managing the first OR case. And the second team? We only have 1 active OR. At Harlow this size, there are 2 OR suites. Suite B is in the dark corridor. It has its own emergency power tap," Mara said. "Separate circuit from the east wing. If your facilities team ran the bypass, it's probably operational." She watched him. "Did anyone check?" A pause that lasted slightly too long. She had her answer. "I'll find out," Holt said, in the voice of a man who had just been handed a task. Then he made him feel slightly less useless, and he turned and walked to the facilities. Radio stations, and the 2 nurses went with him, and none of them looked back. The man with the broken wrist found her 20 minutes later. She was in the intermediate zone when he appeared at her elbow, 50s, heavyset, still in the business clothes he'd been wearing when the explosion caught him in the hospital parking structure. His wrist was splinted with the improvised board one of the triage volunteers had applied, and his face held the expression of a man who had been waiting too long and had decided this was someone else's fault. "Excuse me," he said. "I have been sitting in that section for 45 minutes, and nobody has looked at my wrist." "Someone splinted it," Mara said without stopping. "That was a volunteer. I want a doctor. Everyone in the immediate zone needs a doctor urgently than you do right now. My wrist could be broken. It is broken. Probably. The splint is appropriate until we can get imaging. You're not in danger. I'm in pain." Mara stopped. She turned and looked at him fully, which she had the sense people rarely did, just stopped and looked without the professional filter, with the actual weight of her attention. He blinked. "Sir," she said, "you walked here under your own power. Your color's good. You're breathing normally. You're in pain, but you're not in distress. I have a man 12 feet away who may have a bleed on his brain, a woman who took debris to her chest and can't breathe without help, and another person whose blood pressure is dropping. They need me more than you need me right now." She held his gaze. "When I have someone who can look at your wrist properly, I will send them to you. I promise you that." He looked at the immediate zone, at the head injury patient, at the woman with the chest injury, breathing in short, shallow pulls. He went back to his section and sat down. It was the kind of moment that had no value in a performance review. Nobody was going to write it up, but it was the kind of thing that kept a triage zone from slicing sideways, and Mara knew it, and she moved on. Or Suite B came online 41 minutes after the explosion, which was slower than it should have been, but faster than Mara had feared. Holt's facilities team had found the bypass and run it, which was the right call, made too late but still made. And she gave him credit for that in the internal ledger she kept, because the ledger was supposed to be accurate, not partisan. The first surgical team pulled the chest injury patient at 11:47. The head injury patient went to CT when the imaging suite came back online at 12:03. Mara was in the process of reassessing the intermediate zone when Solano appeared at her shoulder and said quietly, "The Admiral wants a word." "The Admiral's with his daughter. His daughter is in pre-op. He's outside." Mara handed her clipboard to Graves and followed Solano through the main entrance into the cold night air of the Harlow parking area, which had been transformed in the hours since the explosion into something that resembled a forward operating base more than a hospital parking lot. Military vehicles at the perimeter. Triage tents being staked at the far end. 2 helicopters on the cleared section of the lot, engines cycling down, rotor wash flattening the grass at the edges. Admiral Roderick Wentworth was standing near the second helicopter. He was a tall man even in this light, in this context, even stripped of the uniform that had shaped so much of his life. He was somewhere in his early 60s, gray-haired and straight-backed, and he had the face of someone who had made too many decisions with bad information and had found a way to live with the outcomes. He turned when Mara came around the hood of the nearest vehicle. "How is she?" Mara asked before he could speak. "In surgery in 20 minutes, he said. They found the bleed, where you said it was." Mara nodded. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't. You weren't there. My daughter was there for 6 hours before that explosion. I should have." He stopped, restarted. "She called me from the ER at 9:50. Said she was okay. I took her word for it. So did her doctor. Her doctor ignored a nurse who was specifically telling him otherwise." His voice had a controlled edge that Mara recognized as the sound of anger being managed rather than absent. That's different. The wind came off the mountains north of Crestfall and moved through the parking lot with the specific cold of high-altitude October, and Mara pulled her fleece tighter and stood with it. "What did Solano say to you?" she asked. "On the radio." "Earlier." He studied her face. "She told me who you were. What you did before Harlow. I'm a nurse. You're also the woman who extracted 2 casualties from a collapsed building in Logman province without backup and kept both of them alive until the medevac arrived." He watched her reaction. "Brace's unit. 2014. She was quiet for a moment. You looked me up fast. I have resources." He said it without apology. "I wanted to know who was with my daughter in that room." Mara looked toward the hospital, toward the lit windows of the ER, and the dark windows of the East Wing and the soft glow of OR Suite B coming online on the 2nd floor. "She's strong," Mara said. "Your daughter. She stayed present. That matters more than people think. She said you talked to her the whole time. It keeps people anchored. Is that a field medicine technique?" "It's a human technique." She looked at him. "What happens now? With your unit?" "We stay until the hospital is stable. 48 hours at minimum, maybe more." He paused. "I've also asked our JAGAG contact to make a preliminary inquiry into the circumstances surrounding your suspension." Mara went still. "That's not necessary," she said. "Sadie could have died because a doctor filed a preemptive suspension notice to silence a nurse who caught his mistake." His voice was level, but the level was doing work. "That's necessary." "Admiral, he had paperwork ready before the shift ended," Wentworth said. "That's not a judgment call made under pressure. That's a premeditated action." He held her gaze. "I want to know if it's the first time he's done it." The cold settled in around them. From inside the hospital, a radio crackled. From the second helicopter, one of the crew chiefs was running through a post-flight check, his voice carrying in the still air with that particular floating quality that sound had at altitude. Mara said, "Let your legal people do what they need to do, but let it be its own thing, separate from Sadie." "It is separate. You know what I mean?" He did. She could see it. He was a man who had sent people into situations that went wrong and had learned to live with the difference between what he intended and what resulted, and that experience had taught him something about the gap between a personal stake and a just outcome. "All right," he said. She turned to go back inside. "Calloway." She stopped. "What rank were you when you got out?" She looked back at him over her shoulder. "Petty Officer First Class," she said. He nodded once, slowly. The way people nod when a piece of information lands in a place that was already shaped to receive it. She went back inside. The lobby triage zone held through the night. The head injury patient came back from CT with a finding that was serious but manageable. A slow subdural bleed that the neurosurgeon on call addressed in OR Suite B at 2 a.m, while the chest injury patient was still in recovery. And a third critical case, a man who had been caught under debris in the East Corridor, was being prepped for abdominal surgery in the main OR. Mara moved through the zones in her circuit, checking, adjusting, flagging, handing off. Holt reappeared at 1:30. He had changed into fresh scrubs, which meant he had found time to go to his office and regroup, which Mara noted without particular feeling. He moved through the triage floor differently than he had 3 hours ago, not subdued exactly, but recalibrated, as as if the evening had adjusted his internal sense of the room's power topology, and he was navigating the updated version. He stopped near the intermediate zone and watched Mara work for a moment. "The second OR case is stable," he said. "Good. I want to run the critical zone rotation myself," he said. "From here until morning." Mara looked at him. He was a capable surgeon, a genuinely capable surgeon. She had always known that, even in the middle of everything else. "I'll brief you on where everything stands," she said. She briefed him for 12 minutes, standing at the zone boundary with her clipboard, going through each critical patient, by case, by current status, by next decision point. He listened without interrupting, which cost him something she could see it did, but he listened. When she finished, he said, "Wentworth patient. You flagged it at intake?" 9:52 p.m., she said. Then again at 10:41. He was looking at the clipboard, not at her. Second time was when her pressure started to fall. Second time was 40 minutes before her pressure started to fall. He didn't say anything. She handed him the clipboard. She went to check on Graves. At 3:47 in the morning, Solano found her in the hospital cafeteria, which had been converted into a rest and staging area. Masa was sitting with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a wound on her right palm, a small gash she'd caught on a piece of debris in the corridor and hadn't bothered to address until now, which she was taping up with supplies from a basic first aid kit because the gesture of taking 2 smints herself felt like something she owed the rest of the night. Solano sat across from her. "Your patient is out of surgery," she said. "They got the bleed. She's critical, but they're calling it controlled." Mara let out a breath that had been waiting in her chest for longer than she'd realized. "And Holt's managing the zones," Solano continued. "So you should sleep for 2 hours if you can. I don't sleep well in hospitals. Nobody does." Solano looked at her hands, at the tape job on the palm. "You should have someone look at that properly." "I am someone. You know what I mean." Mara finished taping the bandage. It was uneven on one edge. She smoothed it down, and it didn't stay. She smoothed it again. "The Admiral's JAG contact," she said. "How much is he going to find?" Solano was quiet for a moment. "Enough," she said. "If it's there. What does that mean?" "It means that if Holt has done this to other nurses, filed preemptive paperwork, used the suspension process to silence clinical disagreement, there'll be a pattern. And patterns are findable." She paused. "The question is whether the hospital administration knew and chose not to look, or knew and chose not to act." Mara drank the cold coffee. "Either way," she said. "Either way," Solano agreed. From somewhere in the building, a door opened and released a wash of hallway sound voices, monitors, the particular rhythm of a hospital in motion, and then closed again and left them in the cafeteria quiet. Mara was looking at the coffee cup, at the way the overhead light bounced off the surface, at nothing in particular. "I should have pushed harder at intake," she said. Solano looked at her. "You pushed twice. He had paperwork ready. I should have gone over his head." "To who? He's the attending director." Solano's voice was not unkind. "The system he was in gave him authority over every escalation path below him." "I know. That's not a failure of your judgment. That's a failure of the system." "The system didn't almost let Sadie Wentworth die," Mara said. "He did." The word almost was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and both of them knew it. Solano was quiet. Then she said, "Brace's team called you the steadiest hand they'd ever worked with. In any structure, under any condition." She looked at Mara across the cafeteria table. "That's not a small thing." Mara said nothing. "It's also not a thing that goes away because you took a civilian job," Solano added. "You don't leave it behind. It's just waiting." Outside the cafeteria, in the main corridor, a sound changed. Mara registered it a half-second before Solano did a shift in the ambient noise of the floor, voices rising in a particular register, not panic but urgency, the sound a floor makes when something unexpected is happening and the people on it are moving to find out what. Both women were on their feet before either of them made a conscious decision. They came through the cafeteria door into the corridor and moved toward the sound, which was coming from the administrative wing, not the ER, not the triage lobby, not the surgical corridor. The administrative wing, which should have been empty at 4 in the morning, Solano's radio crackled. The voice on it belonged to Graves, who was not the kind of person who sounded unsettled. Graves sounded unsettled. Solano, we've got a situation. Administration level. Someone pulled the emergency archive server offline. Someone with internal credentials accessed the backup documentation system and started deleting files. A pause. Timestamp shows the access started 40 minutes ago. Mara and Solano looked at each other. Which files? Solano said into the radio. The answer came back in 5 words, and each one landed in the corridor air like something thrown. Wentworth intake, Trerridge records tonight. Mara stopped walking. The emergency backup system. The one that preserved every clinical notation made during a declared mass casualty event. The one that logged timestamps, assessments, personnel IDs, and treatment decisions in a tamper-resistant archive, specifically designed to document what happened and when and who made which call. Someone was inside that system. Deleting tonight. Deleting the notations made at 9:52 p.m. and 10:41 p.m. by a nurse whose badge no longer had her name on it. Solano was already on a different radio channel, pulling her unit's security coordinator. Mara was already moving, not toward the administrative wing, but toward the ER, toward the attending station, toward the section of the building where a man in fresh scrubs had taken over the critical zone rotation at 1:30 in the morning and had been managing it, apparently, ever since. She pushed through the ER door. The attending station was empty. Holt was gone. The attending station held the specific emptiness of a space recently vacated, the chair pushed out at an angle, a coffee cup still steaming faintly, the critical zone clipboard set down in the middle of the desk rather than hung in its bracket, as if someone had put it there mid-thought and walked away before finishing the thought. Mara stood at the station for exactly 3 seconds. Then she moved. The administrative wing was 2 corridors east of the ER, accessible through a connecting hallway that ran behind the imaging suite. At 4 in the morning, with half the building on emergency power, the corridor was lit by the flat industrial red of backup lighting, and the shadows it threw were long and specific. Mara's footsteps were quiet on the linoleum, not deliberately quiet, just the natural result of someone who had learned, over years in both military and hospital contexts, that noise was usually optional. She heard him before she saw him, not his voice, his breathing the slightly elevated rate of a person working with urgency in a quiet room, and underneath that, the soft tap of fingers on a keyboard that was not operating quietly enough. The door to the administrative records annex was partially open. Mara stopped at the door frame. Holt was at the terminal against the far wall, his back to her, still in his fresh scrubs. The screen's glow lit him from the front, which meant his face was invisible to her, but she could read everything else, the forward lean, the tight economy of his movements, the specific posture of a person trying to be fast without making mistakes, which was the posture of someone who knew that what they were doing was both urgent and wrong. He hadn't heard her. She had a choice, and she had approximately 4 seconds to make it. If she confronted him here, he would stop. He might lock the terminal. He might manage to delete whatever he was trying to delete in the 30 seconds it took Solano's team to arrive. If she walked away and waited for Solano, he might finish. She stepped into the room. "What files are you pulling?" she said. He spun in the chair so fast he nearly came out of it. The expression on his face cycled through several things: shock, then something that was almost caught, and then, with a speed that told her he had prepared for some version of this, a reconstruction. The face reassembled itself into the professional authority he wore, the way other people wore coats. Calloway. His voice was controlled, almost. "This isn't." "Don't," she said. He stopped. She walked closer. Not confrontationally, just close enough to see the screen. The emergency archive system was open on the terminal. The file directory was visible. 2 items were already moved to the deletion queue. A third was selected. She read the timestamp on the selected file. 22/0/22/15. The 15-minute window that included Sadie Wentworth's intake. That included the first notation. "You're deleting the archive copies," she said. The archive system was behaving inconsistently. I was running a manual review. You used your admin credentials to access the archive outside of normal audit protocol. At 4 in the morning, she looked at him. That's logged separately, Marcus. Every access to that system is logged in a mirror server that doesn't sit inside this network. She didn't actually know if that was true. She had worked enough mass casualty documentation protocol in her military service to know it was the kind of thing that should be true. Whether Harlow had implemented it correctly was a different question. But Holt didn't know she didn't know. His jaw moved. He looked at the screen. He looked at her. "That notation you made at intake," he said slowly, "was incomplete. The clinical rationale was insufficient, for I made a complete clinical notation at 22:52 and a second one at 22:41, Mara said. "Both are in that archive. Both predate the patient's decompensation by significant margins. And both contain specific language recommending cross-sectional imaging for suspected internal hemorrhage." She watched him. "Deleting them doesn't make the patient's presentation retroactively different, say. The imaging findings will still be what they are. The surgical notes will still say what they say. Sut. I want you to leave this room. Solano's team is coming down the corridor right now." A pause, the longest one of the evening. He looked at the door, then back at her. "I missed it," he said. Quiet, the voice under the professional voice, the one that had less performance in it. She was stable at intake. Her vitals were within. "I know what her vitals were," Mara said. "I was there. I also know that mechanism of injury and physical examination findings can indicate hemorrhage before vital sign changes. That's basic trauma teaching. That's not a judgment call you get to reframe." Something collapsed behind his eyes. Not entirely. The reconstruction was still happening. The face was still holding its shape. But something underneath went. "I've been running this department for 11 years, he said. "I know. I have not had a significant patient safety event in." "You had one tonight," Mara said. "And the response you chose was to walk away from the critical zone you were supposed to be managing and come in here to erase the record of it." The door behind her opened. Solano came in with 2 of her unit's personnel, not forcefully, not dramatically, but with the particular quality of people who had been trained to enter rooms containing uncertain situations and make them certain. Holt looked at Solano, at the 2 personnel behind her, at the terminal. He pushed the chair back from the desk and stood up with the careful movements of a man deciding what his next posture was going to be, settling on a version of cooperation that still had the shape of dignity in it. "I'll need to contact the hospital's legal counsel," he said. "That's your right," Solano said. She looked at Mara. "Files? 2 in the deletion queue. 1 selected. Nothing confirmed deleted, yet the system requires a secondary confirmation step, and it looks like he was at that step when I walked in." Mara looked at the terminal. "The mirror log will have the access record regardless." Solano nodded to one of her personnel, who went to the terminal. Holt looked at Mara with an expression she had never seen on his face. In 2 years, not anger, not dismissal, not the performed patience that had been his default register with her. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who was recalculating a version of himself that had just become unavailable. "You weren't supposed to be here," he said. Not accusatory. Almost wondering. "No," Mara said. "I was supposed to be in the parking lot." She left him with Solano. The eastern sky through the lobby windows was beginning to think about gray, the specific pre-dawn non-color that arrived an hour before any actual light and meant the night had used most of itself up. Mara came back through the ER and into the triage lobby, which had quieted in the past 2 hours, not empty, not resolved, but stabilized in the way that mass casualty events eventually stabilized when the acute phase passed and the slow work of sustained care took over. Graves was running the intermediate zone. She looked up when Mara came through. "Holt's not coming back to the floor," Mara said. Graves absorbed this without visible reaction, which was one of the things Mara had come to appreciate about her in the past several hours. "I've got it," she said. "I know you do." Mara checked the critical zone. The 3 most acute patients were stable the chest injury, recovering in the surgical ward, the head injury in monitored ICU care, the 3rd surgical case in recovery. The rest of the zone had patients who were serious but not immediately deteriorating, and the nursing staff managing them had found their footing in the hours since the initial chaos and were running the floor with the practical competency of people who had been forced to discover what they were capable of. Decker appeared at her shoulder. "The board is going to want a debrief at 6, he said. "Administration is already sending people in. What did you tell them?" "That we manage the event and are currently in sustained care phase." He paused. "I also told them that Nurse Calloway was instrumental in establishing the triage system and that her suspension should be reviewed." Mara looked at him. "I watched you work tonight," he said simply, and walked back to his station. There was nothing clean about the next 2 hours. The administrative process that began when Solano's unit formally reported the archive access incident generated a cascade of documentation and notification that moved through the hospital's on-call administration chain, pulling people out of bed and into phone calls, and then into the building itself, arriving in the lobby in various stages of professional composure with the particular energy of people who had understood something had gone wrong and not yet understood how wrong. Mara was interviewed twice before 6 a.m. Once by the hospital's internal risk management coordinator, a sharp-faced woman named Aldridge, who asked precise questions and wrote every answer down in a notebook she carried in her coat pocket. Once by the same JAG contact Wentworth had mentioned a compact, methodical man named Strathmore, who introduced himself with the specific formality of someone who understood that what he was doing would eventually become paperwork with real consequences. Both interviews happened in the cafeteria because every administrative office was either occupied or part of an active scene. Mara answered every question accurately. She corrected herself twice when she realized she was narrating events in the wrong sequence, and she said, "So, let me back up. The second notation was before the power failure, not after, because accuracy mattered more than sounding certain, and both Aldridge and Strathmore made notes when she corrected herself, which she thought was probably a good sign about both of them. Between the interviews, she went to the family waiting area on the 2nd floor. Admiral Wentworth was there. He was sitting in the chair closest to the surgical ward door, still in his civilian clothes, with the posture of a man who had been in that chair for several hours and had made his peace with it. He looked up when Mara came in. "She's stable," he said. "I heard. They're saying she'll be in recovery for most of today. Then we'll know more about the next steps." He looked at his hands. The surgeon said another 45 minutes, and the bleed would have been. He stopped. Resets. She said another 45 minutes would have changed the outcome significantly. Mara sat in the chair across from him. She was tired in the specific way that came after high-demand sustained operation. The fatigue that wasn't sleepiness so much as a hollowing out. The body having used most of what it had, and now running an inventory of what remained. "Holt is being held for formal inquiry," Wentworth said. "Strathmore called me 20 minutes ago." "It'll take time," Mara said. "Things that matter usually do." She looked at the door to the surgical ward. "She's going to be angry, you know. When she comes around, she's going to be angry that it got to this point. She'll be alive to be angry," Wentworth said. "That's what I'll tell her." Mara stood up. Calloway, his voice, stopped her at the door. "Solano told me something." She turned. "She said your military record was sealed at discharge." That you requested it. He looked at her steadily. Why did you bury it? Mara thought about how to answer that. There were several true answers, and none of them were simple. When I came out, she said, I wanted to do the work without the background being the story. I didn't want to be the former military corpsman in the trauma unit. I wanted to be a nurse. She paused. I thought I could be just that. And instead I was the nurse nobody listened to, she said. She went back to the floor. The next escalation came from a direction nobody had anticipated. At 6:47 a.m., as the administrative debrief was beginning in the hospital's main conference room, a room that was now containing hospital board members, military liaison officers, risk management, and two attorneys in various stages of being briefed, a second inquiry arrived. Not internal. The Wyoming Department of Health sent notification at 6:52 that it was opening a formal investigation into patient safety practices at Harlow Memorial Medical Center, triggered by the emergency archive access incident and the documented suspension of a clinical staff member during an active mass casualty event. Not an audit, an investigation. The distinction was specific and significant. An audit reviewed practices. An investigation examined whether those practices constituted violations of patient safety law. Aldridge brought Mara the notification at 7:08 in the middle of the floor handoff. Mara read it. Read it again. This is broader than Holt, she said. Yes, Aldridge said. It's looking at the suspension process and the pattern of clinical disagreement suppressions. Specifically, Aldridge looked at her over the paper. Strathmore's team pulled Holt's personnel file this morning. Your 2 write-ups are in there. So are 4 others, 3 nurses, 1 resident. All in the past 3 years. All following documented instances of clinical disagreement. She paused. All within 48 hours of the disagreement. 6 people. Mara looked at the notification. The pattern that Solano had said was findable had been found faster than either of them had expected, which meant it was not a subtle pattern. It was the pattern of someone who had done this enough times that he had stopped being careful about the shape it left. She handed the notification back. The floor needs to be handed off properly, she said. Can this wait 40 minutes? Aldridge looked at her. Yes. Mara went back to the floor. She ran the handoff methodically, going through each patient zone with the incoming day shift charge nurse, a tall, exhausted woman named Purcell, who had been called in early and was visibly working to hold the magnitude of the night in her head without being overwhelmed by it. Intermediate zone, 6 patients currently, 3 approaching discharge criteria, Mara said. Critical zone, 3 post-surgical, all in the ward. The head injury in ICU is the most active watch. The neurosurgeon wants 2-hour assessments until noon. She went down the list. Triage lobby still has 8 patients in the green zone who haven't been fully cleared. That's the first priority for your morning. Purcell was writing. And the temporary triage system? The lobby setup? Graves can brief you on the details. She built half of it. Mara looked at Graves across the lobby. She's better at explaining it than I am. Graves, who had heard none of this from 30 feet away, looked up as if she'd felt the attention, caught Mara's eye, and gave a single nod that communicated everything. Purcell stopped writing and looked at Mara. They're saying you were suspended when this started. I was, and you came back through the debris. The patient needed. I know what the patient needed, Purcell said. Not harshly. I'm saying you came back. Mara looked at the lobby, at the tri-zones, at the patients and staff and military personnel and the complicated human machinery of a hospital that had held itself together through the worst night of its institutional life. Someone had too, she said, and handed Purcell the clipboard. She was in the corridor heading toward the conference room when her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. No name attached. Short. Archive confirmed intact. Deletion queue cleared before confirmation. Nothing lost. Strathmore, she stopped walking. She read it twice. Nothing deleted. The notations were there. Both of them, the 952 entry and the 1041 entry, intact in the emergency archive, time-stamped and logged, and completely intact. Holt had been stopped before he had finished what he came to do, and the evidence of what he had tried to do was itself now part of the record. She put the phone in her pocket. She was almost at the conference room door when the call came over the floor. Radio. Not her radio. Purcell's, 20 feet behind her, but loud enough to carry in the corridor quiet. Second floor nursing station. We need a clinical consult immediately. Patient in surgical recovery, suite C, reporting acute chest pain and stand by a pause, the kind that happened when someone was reading a monitor. Elevated troponin on the point of care. We need someone up here now. Purcell's voice, I'm coming. Mara had already turned around. She was moving back down the corridor at a pace below running and above, walking the specific gear that hospital corridors required, fast enough to arrive functional, controlled enough to arrive functional. Purcell was behind her. They went through the stairwell door together. Who's in Suite C? Mara asked. Purcell checked her clipboard while walking. Surgical recovery, that's the chest trauma from last night. Harlan, 58. Thoracic repair completed at. The debris injury, Mara said. Yes. They came through the surgical recovery door. Harlan was a big man, and sick people were never big in the way they usually were. They became smaller and flatter, and somehow more present in the wrong way, as if illness collapsed the spatial buffer that healthy people carried around themselves. He was gray-faced and sweat-soaked and gripping the side rail of his bed with his left hand in a way that was not decorative. The recovery nurse, young, competent, visibly managing her own alarm, met them at the door. Onset about 12 minutes ago, she said. Pain is substernal, radiating left shoulder. Troponin on the point of care is 0.42. Baseline post-surgical was. Get cardiology on the phone, Mara said. Who's the attending for this ward right now? Dr. Voss. She's in surgery. Pull her out. She's mid-procedure. Get her on the phone between steps. She'll want to know. Mara was at the bedside. She put her hand on Harlan's wrist pulse, rapid, irregular in a way she didn't like. She looked at the monitor. The rhythm was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong yet, but the specific flavor of wrong that had a direction to it, a trajectory, and the trajectory was not good. Mr. Harlan, she said, I need you to tell me where the pain is right now. Point to it. He pointed to the center of his chest. Here. Started 20 minutes ago, but I thought it was the surgery. Is it getting better or worse? Same. A pause. Maybe worse. Okay. I need you to stay as still as you can. We're getting help. Purcell was on the phone already. The recovery nurse was pulling the crash cart. Mara ran the secondary assessment neuro intact, abdomen soft, the chest repair site looked clean, and built the picture in real time from the pieces she had. Post-surgical myocardial event. Stress-induced? Possibly. Or a secondary injury from the thoracic trauma that had been missed in the initial surgical assessment because the immediate priority had been the structural repair. It happened. It was the kind of thing that happened when you were treating a mass casualty event in a compromised hospital with reduced resources, and you got the primary problem right and missed the downstream one. Cardiology was on the phone in 4 minutes. Dr. Voss was pulled from her procedure in 6. Mara talked to both of them from the bedside, concise, specific, no embellishment, the exact language of a person who had learned to give clinical information to physicians the way you gave coordinates, accurate and fast and without the parts that wasted time. She was mid-sentence with Voss when she noticed what was happening with Harlan's rhythm on the monitor. The irregular pattern she'd identified was changing, not stabilizing, organizing itself into something that had a specific name, a specific shape, a specific treatment window measured in minutes rather than hours. Vossmer said, I need you in this room. A pause on the phone. Then, I'm coming. She looked at the recovery nurse. Get the defibrillator pads on now, she said. Don't charge yet. Just on. The nurse moved. Purcell came to stand beside Mara and looked at the monitor and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say. The monitor said it clearly enough, and both of them could read it. Harlan looked up at Mara from the bed. His color had gone from gray to the particular ash white that preceded worse things. He was scared. She could see it in the way he was holding the rail, in the quality of his breathing, in the fact that he was looking at her instead of the ceiling. "Am I going to be okay?" he said. The honest answer was, "I don't know yet." That was the accurate answer. That was the real answer. "I'm going to do everything I can," she said. "Right now, that's enough." It wasn't enough. She knew that. He probably knew that. But it was something to hold on to, and sometimes holding on to something was the mechanism by which you survived the next 3 minutes. The door opened. Voss came in, still in her surgical cap, moving fast. She looked at the monitor. Her expression did the thing that the faces of experienced physicians did when they saw a specific pattern that required a specific response. It went neutral, which was a kind of professional fear response, the face locking itself down to preserve functional capacity. "Get cath lab on the line," she said. "They're a referral facility," the recovery nurse said. "We don't have a cath lab." Voss looked at the monitor, at Mara, at Harlan. "How far to St. Benedine?" 45 minutes by ground, Purcell said. "Air? 19, maybe 22. Voss looked toward the window. Outside in the parking lot, the military helicopters were still there. Their crews were still active. "Solano," Mara said. She said it to Purcell, who said it into the radio. 17 seconds later, Solano's voice came back. "We can fly a patient to St. Benedine. What's the situation?" Mara looked at Voss, who nodded. "Suspected MI, post-surgical, needs cath lab intervention. Stable enough to transport, but the window is 20 minutes, Voss said. 20 minutes, Mara relayed. "A beat. I need 5 minutes to prep the aircraft," Solano said. "Get your patient to the lot." Voss was already calling prep orders. The recovery nurse was moving. Purcell was coordinating with the floor below for a transport team. Mara stayed at the bedside and kept Harlan talking about anything, about the pain level, about whether his daughter knew he was here, about what he would eat when this was over, because the talking kept him from disappearing into himself, which was where frightened people went when they had nothing to hold on to. "You're going to another hospital," she told him. "One with more equipment. The helicopter is ready." "A helicopter," he said. The gray face managed something. "Fast way to travel." "I've never been in one." "It's loud," she said. "That's the main thing to know." The transport team arrived. She walked with the gurney to the elevator. She walked it to the lobby. She walked it out through the main entrance into the cold morning air, where the sun had finally committed to rising and was doing it in the flat, specific way of High Plains October. No warmth yet but light everywhere. The parking lot and the triage tents and the military vehicles all lit in the same clean lateral illumination. The helicopter crew was ready. She helped transfer Harlan to the aircraft gurney with the practiced economy of someone who had done this before, in worse conditions and smaller spaces. He gripped her wrist before they loaded him. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Get fixed first." He almost smiled. They loaded him. The rotors spun up. The sound swallowed everything for 30 seconds, that enormous mechanical presence that left no room for anything else. And then the helicopter lifted and banked north and was gone, and the lot went quiet except for the wind. Mara stood and watched the sky where it had been. Her right palm ached under the tape. She was 32 years old and had been awake for nearly 24 hours, and somewhere in the hospital, behind her, administrative proceedings were beginnings that would reshape her professional life in ways she couldn't fully calculate. Somewhere in surgical recovery, the paperwork of Holt's inquiry was accumulating. Somewhere in the family waiting area on the second floor, a retired admiral was sitting in a chair by a door, waiting for news about his daughter. She turned to go back inside. Strathmore was standing at the main entrance. She had not heard him come out. He was holding a folder, which told her the paperwork phase of whatever was happening had already produced physical documents, which meant it was moving faster than she'd expected. "We need to talk," he said. "I know. Not about the archive." He looked at her. "About the other files." She waited. "Holt's write-up system," Strathmore said. "We pulled the records for all 6 disciplinary actions in the past 3 years, cross-referenced with patient outcome data for the cases that generated clinical disagreement." He held her gaze. In 4 of the 6 cases, the nurse or resident who raised the concern was correct. Patient outcomes support it. 4 out of 6. 4 cases where the clinical disagreement was accurate. The record showed it, and the person who raised it was written up and silenced. "How many patients?" Mara said. 3 with documented adverse outcomes that may be attributable to Strathmore stopped. Selected a more careful construction. 3 with outcomes that are under review in the context of treatment decisions that were made after the clinical disagreement was suppressed. Mara thought about the shape of that. 3 patients. Patients she had never met. Patients who had moved through this hospital in the years before she arrived, or in the years she had been here, but in different units, different shifts, different parts of the building. Patients who had been failed by a system that a man had designed to protect himself, and who had no nurse left in the corridor to come back through the debris for them. "The department's investigation will be formal and may take months," Strathmore said. "But I wanted you to know the direction it was heading." He paused. "Because you're likely to be called as a witness. Multiple times. I'll be available." And because he stopped again, this version of stopping was different. Less procedural. Because the documentation you put in that chart tonight is what made all of this findable. Both notations, the timestamps, the specific clinical language you used. He looked at the folder. "If either of those entries had been deleted, this stays an isolated incident. A bad night. A he said, she said." He looked up. "Because of what you wrote, and because you wrote it twice, it's a pattern." Mara was very still. "She's going to be okay," Strathmore said. Sadie Wentworth. "The surgical team is calling the repair a success. She's expected to make a full recovery." The sun was fully up now. It hit the parking lot with the indifferent brightness of a morning that was happening regardless, that had no position on what the night had contained. Mara nodded once. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She turned toward the entrance. The hospital doors slid open. The warmth of the interior came out to meet her, and she stepped through. She was 3 steps inside when Solano came through the same doors behind her, radio in hand, moving fast, and the expression on her face was the one that Mara had learned in the past several hours meant incoming situation rather than incoming resolution. "I need you," Solano said. "What happened?" "The archive server." Solano was already moving down the corridor. Strathmore's IT team finished the forensic review. "And the access credentials Holt used tonight." Solano glanced back at her. "The login shows he accessed that archive system before. Not just tonight." Mara kept moving. "When?" 3 times in the past professionally. "Tsuya passed 18 months. Solano's voice was controlled, but the control was doing the same kind of work that Holtz had done in the annex room earlier, covering something that was larger than what the surface showed. Each time following a documented patient safety complaint. Each time within 72 hours of the complaint being filed. Mara's mind ran the arithmetic. 3 prior access events. 4 clinical disagreements with adverse outcomes. 6 total suppression actions. The numbers didn't overlap cleanly, which meant there were combinations she wasn't seeing yet, timelines that hadn't been fully reconstructed, a picture that was more extensive than what had been visible an hour ago. "Where are you going?" she said. "Server room. IT wants a witness while they complete the forensic extraction." Solano looked at her. "I want that witness to be you." "Why me?" Solano stopped walking. She turned and faced Mara in the corridor with the flat emergency lighting and the distant sound of the hospital doing its work, and the morning coming in through the windows at the far end, and her expression was the one that came before, something that had weight to it. Because what's on that server, she said, is not just about tonight. She started walking again. Mara followed. They went down the east corridor, past the damaged section, past the sealed door that led to what remained of the section where Sadie Wentworth's bay had been, past the evidence of the night written into the walls of the building itself, toward the server room at the base of the administrative wing. The IT technician, a man named Ferris, who had been called in at 5 a.m. and looked like a person who had been called in at 5 a.m., was waiting at the door. He had a laptop open. On the screen was a directory listing. Mara did not immediately understand file names, and timestamps arranged in a column, dozens of entries, some flagged in red. She looked at the timestamps. The oldest entry on the flagged list was dated 19 months ago. Then she looked at the patient identifier codes next to each entry. She didn't recognize most of them. They were codes, not names anonymized the way archive systems anonymized patient data, cross-referenced by a key that lived in a separate, secure location. But there was one she recognized, not because she had treated the patient, because she had read the case in her first month at Harlow in the incident review file that nurses were expected to familiarize themselves with when they joined a new unit. A case that had been classified as an expected adverse outcome. A case that had been reviewed internally and closed. The patient identifier matched. Mara looked at Ferris. That case was closed. It was closed, Ferris said. But the archive access record shows the file was accessed and modified 9 days after the internal review concluded. He looked at his screen. The modification timestamp is inside the file metadata. Whoever altered it didn't clear the metadata. He looked up. "We think there are at least 7 cases," he said. The number landed in the server room with the weight of something that had been waiting to arrive for a long time. 7 cases. Not one bad night. Not one suppressed disagreement. Not an aberration or a lapse or a single catastrophic misjudgment on the worst night the hospital had seen. A practice. Mara stood in the server room with the laptop screen and the fluorescent light and the specific cold of a room full of machines that ran all night without anyone noticing. And she thought about the nurses who had written things in charts and been handed suspension notices and walked to the parking lot alone. She thought about the patients in those files. "How fast can you extract the full data set?" she said. Ferris looked at his laptop. "Couple hours if the server cooperates." "There are some corrupted sectors in the work around them," Mara said. "Whatever you can get, get it." She looked at Solano. "Strathmore needs to know." "He already does," Solano said. "He's been on the phone with the department for 20 minutes. And the board? Emergency session at 9. Solano checked her watch. "That's 90 minutes from now." Mara looked at the screen. At the flagged entries. At the oldest timestamp 19 months ago. A case that had been reviewed and closed and was apparently neither. "Is there anything on here about my write-ups?" she said. Ferris navigated, checked, looked up. "Both of them," he said. "With corresponding archive access records dated within 48 hours. Both write-ups, both times she had disagreed with Holt in a documented, clinical way. Both times she had been handed paperwork that reframed her accuracy as insubordination. Both times he had gone into the archive. She was looking at the screen when Solano's radio came alive again. The voice on it was Graves. "Solonso. The board chair just arrived. He's in the main conference room, and he's asking specifically for Mara Calloway." A pause. "He says he wants her account before the session starts." Solano looked at Mara. "Your call," she said. Mara looked at the screen one more time. At the flagged entries. At the timestamps. At the shape of a thing that had been running quietly inside this hospital for 19 months, maybe longer, and had been made visible tonight by a woman in civilian clothes who had come back through the debris when she had every reason not to. She looked at Ferris. "Get the data," she said. She turned toward the door. And then Graves's voice came over the radio again, tighter this time, with the specific register that Mara had learned in the past several hours to pay close attention to. Solano, there's something else. The board chair didn't come alone. A beat. He brought someone from the state health department. And they're not here for the session. Solano's expression went careful. What do you mean, they're not here for the session? They brought a warrant, Graves said. The radio was quiet for a second. For Holt's office and personnel records, Graves continued. But that's not the thing. Another pause, longer, the kind that happened when someone was reading something carefully before saying it. The warrant lists a second name. Mara stopped at the door. Whose name? Solano said. The pause before Graves answered was 5 seconds long. It was the longest 5 seconds of the morning. Vargas, Graves said. Dr. Lionel Vargas, Chief of Medical Staff. The name landed in the server room with the weight of something that had been sitting in the walls of this building for a long time, waiting for a reason to come out. Mara knew Vargas the way everyone at Harlow knew him, not personally, not in the daily texture of the floor, but as the organizational layer the hospital ran inside of. He was 61, gray-bearded, the kind of administrator who had moved so far from clinical practice that his identity had reorganized itself entirely around institutional authority. He signed personnel decisions above a certain threshold. He approved departmental actions that required executive oversight. He had signed both of Mara's write-ups. She looked at Solano. Solano was already on a different channel. Strathmore. The warrant is Vargas being detained, or is this a records pull? Strathmore's voice came back clipped. Records at this stage. His counsel has been notified. He's in the building. Where? Conference room B, with the board chair. Solano lowered the radio and looked at Mara with the expression of someone revising a picture they thought they'd already finished drawing. He knew, Mara said. That's what the warrant is going to determine, Solano said carefully. He signed both my write-ups. Final approval. If Holt was accessing the archive after complaints and Vargas was signing the suppression paperwork. The legal question is whether he understood what the paperwork was covering. Solano held her gaze. That's a significant distinction. Not a moral one, Mara said. Solano didn't argue. Ferris had gone quiet at his laptop. The particular quiet of a person who has realized the room they are in has become more consequential than anticipated, and has decided the correct response is to focus on the screen. Keep extracting, Mara told him. She went to find the board chair. Gerald Ellison was in the main conference room, late 60s, the bearing of someone who had spent decades in institutional governance, and had developed through long practice the ability to appear composed in situations that were not. He was sitting at the head of the table with 2 board members and the state health department representative, a woman named Pratt who had driven 90 minutes to Crestfall before sunrise and was not planning to leave without everything she'd come for. Vargas was not in the room. Mara registered his absence as data. Dr. Calloway. Ellison stood, a formality she hadn't expected. Thank you for coming. Pratt looked up from her folder. You hold a doctoral-level trauma nursing certification that wasn't listed in your personnel file. It wasn't asked for at hiring. Please sit down, Ellison said. The next 40 minutes were procedurally dense. Pratt asked questions with the patience of someone building a structure rather than conducting a conversation, each one placed to support the next, the whole thing moving toward a destination Mara could see before she arrived at it. She answered accurately. When she misstated a timestamp, she corrected herself and said so because precision mattered more than appearing certain, and both Pratt and Ellison made notes when she did, which told her something about both of them. At one point, Pratt slid a printed document across the table. Her 952 notation, reproduced from the recovered archive file. You used the phrase peritoneal, guarding inconsistent with isolated seatbelt, contusion, Pratt said. That's specific. It's accurate. It's also the language of someone trained to produce documentation that survives scrutiny. She looked up. Your military record was sealed at discharge. Why? I wanted to be evaluated on what I did at Harlow, not on what I'd done before. And instead, you were written up for clinical accuracy. I was written up for disagreeing with the attending, which you were correct to do. Mara held her gaze. The patient outcome supports it. Yes. Sai, the board member on Ellison's right, leaned forward. In your time at Harlow, did you observe other instances where nursing concerns were dismissed and the patient outcome suggested the concern was valid? Mara thought about it for the exact number of seconds it deserved. I observed a culture where the escalation path for nursing disagreement ran directly through the person most likely to suppress it, she said. That's a structural problem. Whether specific outcomes resulted, I can't say with certainty. But the structure made it likely. Sai wrote that down. The session concluded at 8:47. Ellison walked Mara to the door himself. I owe you an apology on behalf of this board, he said. The board didn't suspend me. The board didn't stop it. He held her gaze. That's not meaningfully different. She went back to the floor. Vargas resigned at 9:14. Mara heard it the way most of the hospital heard it, through the velocity of information, in a place where people worked in close proximity. She was in the cafeteria getting her third coffee when Decker appeared with the expression of a man delivering something simultaneous, expected, and still somehow surprising when it arrived. Vargas is out. Effective immediately. Holt, she said. Administrative leave pending full investigation. His counsel showed up an hour ago, not being cooperative on the archive access records. Strathmore has the forensic extraction. I know. I told his counsel that. Decker almost smiled. They got very quiet after. She finished the coffee. It was not a triumphant moment. It was a tired morning in a cafeteria that smelled like industrial cleaner and burned coffee, with plastic chairs and the residual disorder of a space that had been repurposed in an emergency and was coming to itself slowly. Outside the windows, the treasure tents were still standing. The east corridor was still sealed. The hospital was alive. Most of the patients who had come through the night were alive. 2 had died both from injuries unsurvivable regardless of intervention, and their deaths were being documented with the careful precision that institutions applied to loss. The paperwork that tried to give shape to the shapeless. Her phone buzzed. Purcell, Harlan procedure complete. Stable. Attending says good prognosis. Mara put the phone down on the table. Solano came through the cafeteria door. One look at her face, and Mara understood the morning was not finished. Ferris completed the extraction, Solano said. 9 cases. Not 7. She sat across from Mara. Archive access events corresponding to 9 patient safety complaints. 26 months. 26 months, the full lifespan of the archive system in its current form. Whatever had happened before that window was a different kind of question requiring a different investigation. Vargas's signature, Mara said, on 7 of the 9 disciplinary actions that followed. Solano held her gaze. The other 2 were below the approval threshold. Holt signed them himself. 7 out of 9. 7 times a chief of medical staff had reviewed disciplinary paperwork that was suppressing a valid clinical concern, engaged with it enough to recharacterize it in the approval language, and signed his name to it. What happens to him now that he's resigned? His resignation doesn't resolve the state investigation. The health department warrant covers his records regardless of employment status. Solano paused. If the investigation determines he understood what he was signing and Pratt believes the approval language demonstrates that, then it becomes a question of regulatory censure at minimum. Potentially more. Mara thought about the 3 women in the lobby: Madera, Novak, Huang. About 5 other people who had written accurate things in charts and been handed paperwork that reframed their competence as a liability. About 9 files. About 2 deaths under review. The other nurses, she said. Strathmore's team is contacting them? Already started. Solano stood. Board session in 15 minutes. Ellison wants you there. The session ran 3 hours. Mara was not asked to speak for most of it. Ellison had structured it as a formal briefing, building a record that would survive scrutiny. Pratt presented the health department's preliminary findings. Strathmore presented the forensic extraction summary. Ferris walked through the technical evidence, 9 cases, 26 months. Archives access events, correlating in 8 of 9 instances with personnel actions taken within 72 hours of the original complaint. The board listened. Sy asked the questions that indicated she was already thinking about structural reform, what changes the hospital needed to close the gap that Holt and Vargas had operated in. 2 other members were visibly working through the discomfort of people who sit on oversight bodies and are being shown in granular detail what they had been overseeing without seeing. At noon, Ellison called a recess and came to Mara at the table. "Your suspension is vacated effective immediately," he said. "I wanted you to hear it from me before the formal paperwork. I'd like the expungement noted in writing with specific dates and case numbers," she said. He didn't flinch. "It will be." She went to the second floor. Room 7 was quiet, lit by the lower light of the recovery ward. The Admiral opened the door. He looked like a man who hadn't slept and had made peace with that fact sometime around 3 in the morning. Sadie was awake, barely the heavy consciousness of someone surfacing from anesthesia, still more than halfway submerged. But her eyes were open and tracking, and her color, though still wrong in the pale specific way of significant blood loss, was wrong in the direction of alive. She looked at Mara. "You're real," she said. "I'm real." I wasn't sure. Strange dreams. Anesthesia does that. Sadie looked at her father, then back at Mara. "My shoulder doesn't hurt anymore." "It moved somewhere else," Mara said. "The surgery site." "Yes." A pause. "How long until it gets better?" "Weeks." "Then it does." Sadie closed her eyes, not the closing of someone losing consciousness, but of someone processing, holding something, while it settled. Her hand rested on the blanket. Mara thought about how that same hand had gripped her wrist in the dark of the ruined bay, the force of a person holding the only anchor available. The Admiral walked Mara to the door. In the corridor, with the door closed behind them, he looked at her with the full weight of his attention. "The investigation is going to be long," he said. "I know." Depositions. Multiple. State Health Department, the board's external review. Potentially civil proceedings if the families of the 2 deceased patients pursue it. He paused. "You'll be central to most of it. I'll be available for most of it." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" he said. "After all this?" Mara thought about it, genuinely. Not the question of what she was owed, but what she actually wanted, what the next version of this work looked like, what she would build if someone gave her the materials and the space. "I want the reporting structure to be different," she said. "Not just here. The escalation path, the way clinical disagreement gets documented and reviewed. Nurses to have an avenue. I want that's an avenue that doesn't run through the person they're disagreeing with. That's a systemic change. I know what it is." He nodded slowly. Then, Strathmore found something in the extraction this morning. One of the 9 flagged cases. His tone had shifted, not urgency, but gravity. The weight of someone delivering information they know will change something. "The patient safety complaint that preceded it," he said, "wasn't filed by a nurse or a resident." She waited. "It was filed by an attending physician. Someone who documented a concern about Holt's treatment decisions and submitted it through the formal review process." He held her gaze. Holt accessed the archive 18 days later. The complaint was reclassified, moved from active review to closed without action. The attending who filed it left Harlow 6 weeks after that. Mara was still. "Who was it?" she said. "The physician who held the trauma director position before Holt." The timeline assembled itself. 11 years Holt's tenure. His predecessor had still been at Harlow when the archive system came online 26 months ago. Had filed a formal complaint. Had been gone within 6 weeks. How long before Holt took the director position did the predecessor leave? She said. He didn't leave before, Wentworth said. The complaint was filed while both of them were still in the department. Holt was being considered for the director role. The predecessor filed the complaint during that transition period. Mara looked at the floor. Someone with clinical standing had seen what Holt was doing clearly enough to document it formally, had used the correct channel, had named it accurately, and 3 weeks later was gone. Vargas approved the non-renewal, Wentworth said, before she could ask. The predecessor's contract. Vargas signed it. She looked up. How long has Vargas been at Harlow? 14 years. Mara did the arithmetic. 14 years, 3 years before Holt. Which meant Vargas had been in his position when Holt arrived, when Holt built the department around himself, when the predecessor was removed, when the pattern began taking the specific shape it had taken. The archives system only covered 26 months, but the pattern it revealed had a frame that stretched back much further than that. The elevator at the end of the corridor opened. Strathmore stepped out with 2 people she didn't recognize, not hospital staff, not military. Suits, one carrying a document case. He stopped when he saw her. I was coming to find you, he said. Vargas, Mara said. We need to talk about the 14-year timeline before the state health department's follow-up session this afternoon. He paused, and the pause had the quality of someone choosing their next words carefully. These are colleagues from the state attorney general's office. Mara looked at the 2 suits, at the document case. Criminal referral, she said. Strathmore didn't confirm or deny it in words. His expression did the work instead. There's one more thing, he said. The Attorney General's office requested Vargas's complete personnel file this morning going back to his appointment 14 years ago. He looked at her steadily. They found a sealed internal report, filed 13 years ago by a nurse in the ICU. Mara waited. The nurse documented a pattern of suppressed clinical concerns across multiple departments, Strathmore said. Named Vargas, specifically as the administrator signing the suppression actions. A beat. The report was sealed 3 weeks after it was filed. By whom? By the hospital board, under a different chair than the current one. Mara looked at the document case. 13 years. Someone had seen this 13 years ago, had named it, had filed it correctly, through the proper channel with specific documentation. And the board, not Holt, not Vargas, but the governing body of the institution itself, had sealed it. Is she still in nursing? Mara said. Strathmore's expression shifted in a way that had nothing procedural in it. No, he said. The corridor was quiet for a moment. What was in her report? Mara said. Specifically. Strathmore reached into the document case the suited man was carrying and produced into a single printed page, not the full report, a summary, the kind that investigators prepared to give the essential shape of something, without requiring the full document to be present. He handed it to her. She read it. It took 90 seconds. The nurse, her name was in the report, which Morris read once, and did not say aloud, had documented 7 instances across 4 departments over an 18-month period in which valid clinical concerns had been filed through internal channels and subsequently reclassified, dismissed, or buried in administrative review. She had named Vargas in all 7. She had cross-referenced the patient outcomes in 3 of the cases, noting that the suppression of the clinical concerns had preceded adverse events in each one. The report was precise. The language was specific. The documentation was the kind that had clearly been constructed by someone who understood that accuracy was the only protection available to her. 3 weeks later, it was sealed. 6 weeks after that, she was gone. Mara handed the page back to Strathmore. She did everything right, Mara said. Yes, Strathmore said. She documented it accurately. She used the correct channel. She named the specific administrator. She cross-referenced the outcomes. Yes, and the board sealed it. Yes. Mara looked at the suits from the Attorney General's office, at the document case, at the specific morning light coming through the corridor window, flat and clean and indifferent to what it was illuminating. "Then this isn't an investigation into Holt and Vargas," she said. Strathmore was quiet. "This is an investigation into the board," she said. "Or the board that was. The one that received a complete, accurate, formally filed report 13 years ago and chose to seal it. The current board is cooperating fully," Strathmore said carefully. "Ellison has been forthcoming since early this morning. The prior board, several of those members, are no longer in the area. Some are deceased. The ones who are reachable are being contacted. One of the Attorney General's people, the woman, who had been quiet until now, spoke for the first time. "Dr. Calloway, we'd like to ask you some questions this afternoon. About the clinical documentation practices you observed at Harlow, and about the specific language in your archive notations." She paused. "Your documentation is the reason the forensic timeline is as complete as it is. We want to understand how you constructed it." Mara looked at her. "I wrote down what I saw," she said, in specific language. "At the time I saw it. That sounds simple. It is simple. The hard part was that the system was designed to make it feel like the wrong thing to do." The woman wrote something in her notebook. Strathmore looked at Mara. "There's one more element. The nurse who filed the 13-year-old report." He paused. "We reached her this morning. In Portland, she moved there after leaving Harlow. She's been in healthcare administration for a decade, not clinical practice." "Is she willing to speak?" "More than willing." Strathmore held her gaze. "She said she filed that report because she believed the documentation would outlast the institution's ability to ignore it." He paused. "She said she was wrong about the timeline, but not about the principle." Mara looked at the window. 13 years. The documentation had survived sealed, filed, stored in a personnel archive that nobody had opened until the Attorney General's office requested it this morning. 13 years of sitting in a file while the pattern it described continued to operate, continued to expand, continued to find new people to use and discard and silence. But it had survived. "What happens now?" Mara said. "This afternoon's session will establish the formal investigative scope," Strathmore said. "The State Health Department, the Attorney General's office, and the board's external counsel are all present. It's going to be a long session. I'll be there. And the weeks after that," he said, "depositions, document review. The nurse from Portland will likely be a primary witness, but so will you." He looked at her. "You're both going to be asked to carry this for a while." Mara thought about a woman she had never met, who had sat down 13 years ago and sat down specific and written something accurate and specific and correct, who had named the right person and documented the right pattern and filed it through the right channel, and who had been removed from the building and sealed into a file and carried it anyway for 13 years in Portland, doing administration instead of the clinical work she'd trained for. "I can carry it," Mara said. She looked at Strathmore. "At the suits." At the corridor that led back toward the conference wing where the shape of the next several months of her professional life was beginning to assemble itself. "One question," she said. "Ask," Strathmore said. "The board that sealed the original report 13 years ago." She held his gaze. "Who was the chair?" Strathmore looked at the Attorney General's representative. The representative looked at her notebook. She said a name. Mara didn't recognize it. She had never heard it. It meant nothing to her except the shape it made in the corridor air, the name of a person who had received a complete and accurate report about a pattern of institutional harm and had signed the order to bury it. "Where are they now?" she said. "Retired," the representative said. "Still in Wyoming." Mara nodded once. She turned toward the conference room wing. Behind her, she heard Strathmore say something to the Attorney General's people in a low voice, heard the rustle of the document case, heard the elevator open and close. She walked down the corridor alone. The hospital moved around her monitors, footsteps, the ventilation system doing its quiet work, the specific ambient sound of a building that had survived the night and was choosing to continue. Through the windows at the end of the hall, the parking lot was visible, triage tents still standing, military vehicles at the perimeter, the morning light doing what morning light did regardless. She thought about the nurse in Portland. About 13 years of carrying a sealed report. About the fact that the documentation had survived not because the institutions had protected it, but because the institution hadn't known how to destroy something that was already inside its own walls, stored in its own systems, waiting with the patience of accurate information for someone to finally ask the right question. She thought about Sadie in room 7, about Harlan in a cath lab in a different city, about Novak and Madeira and Huang in the lobby this morning, standing in their coats with 13 months and 14 months and 3 years of consequences between them. She thought about what Strathmore had said, because of what you wrote, it's a pattern. She had written it down because it was accurate, because the mechanism of her training, military and clinical both, had drilled into her the discipline of documentation as a form of accountability, not for herself, but for the patient, not for the record, but for the outcome. Not because someone would read it, but because someone might need to. Someone had needed to. She pushed through the conference room door. Ellison looked up from the table. Pratt looked up. The 2 people from the Attorney General's office were already seated. Mara pulled out a chair. She sat down. "Let's start from the beginning," she said. The session lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Mara had been in long rooms before military debriefs, field reviews, the kind of after-action processes that ran until everyone in the room had said everything they knew, and the picture was complete enough to act on. This was different in its setting and identical in its function, and she moved through it the same way. She moved through all of them, accurately, without embellishment, correcting herself when she needed to, and not performing certainty she didn't have. Pratt ran most of the questioning. The Attorney General's of the questioning, the Attorney Blund, the woman whose name was Lund, took over for the sections that concerned the archived documentation and the forensic timeline. Ellison sat at the head of the table and said little, which was the correct instinct for a man whose primary job in this room was to listen and understand the size of what his institution had been carrying. Mara described the intake assessment in precise clinical terms. She described both notations, the timestamps, the specific language she had used, and why she had used it. She described the suspension, the escorted walk to the administrative office, the paperwork that had already been prepared. She described coming back through the debris, and she did it without drama, not because it lacked it, but because the facts were sufficient, and drama was a way of obscuring facts, and she had learned that distinction early and kept it. When Lund asked why she had used documentation language precise enough to survive a formal medical review, Mara said, "Because I was trained that if you see something accurately, you write it accurately, and you write it in language that cannot be reinterpreted later by someone with a different agenda." "Where were you trained to think that way?" Lund said. "The Navy," Mara said, "and 2 years at Harlow." The room was quiet for a moment after that. The session ended at 4:17 in the afternoon. Mara walked out of the conference room into a corridor that was fully lit. The east wing power had been restored at 2 p.m. The emergency lighting finally relieved of its duty, the building returning to its own normal illumination. It looked different in the regular light, less dramatic, more like itself. The formal consequences arrived over the following weeks in the order that institutional processes delivered them, which was slowly and in writing. Marcus Holt was terminated from Harlow Memorial Medical Center 12 days after the explosion. The termination letter, citing deliberate falsification of clinical records, unauthorized access to protected patient documentation, and conduct constituting a patient safety violation under Wyoming state medical law. His medical license was suspended by the state board 41 days after that, pending a full disciplinary hearing. The hearing, when it came, lasted 3 days. The board members heard testimony from Strathmore's investigation, from the forensic extraction, from 4 of the 6 nurses and residents who had been written up in the preceding 3 years, and from the attending physician in Portland, who had filed the original complaint that preceded his appointment to the director role. The license was revoked. It was not revoked cleanly or without contention. Holt's legal team argued process violations and appealed the initial revocation, which extended the timeline and added paperwork and made the months between the hearing and the final determination longer than anyone wanted. But the final determination, when it arrived, was unambiguous. The record falsification was documented. The forensic evidence was intact. The archive, which he had attempted to edit in the early hours of the morning after the explosion, and had failed to edit because Mara had walked through a door at the right moment, contained everything. He lost the license on a Tuesday in late February. Mara was in the trauma unit when Decker told her. She was in the middle of a patient assessment, and she finished it before she responded, and when she did respond, she said okay and went back to work, because there was work, and the work did not pause for satisfying outcomes. Lionel Vargas's path was longer and more complicated, which was the nature of the kind of wrongdoing that had operated at the administrative level with plausible cover and signed paperwork. The State Health Department investigation ran for 5 months. The Attorney General's office ran a parallel process that moved at the specific pace of criminal referrals, which was careful and not fast. His legal counsel was aggressive and well-resourced, and there were periods during those months when the outcome was genuinely uncertain, when the outcome was genuinely room understood, when the gap between what everyone in the room understood had happened and what could be proven to the required standard felt wider than it should. Closed the gap was the Portland nurse's documentation. Her name was Teresa Osei, and she had been 29 years old when she sat down and wrote a report that named Vargas specifically, cross-referenced 7 cases, and submitted it through the formal channel that existed precisely for that purpose. She had done it knowing she said this in her deposition, calmly and without bitterness, with the specific clarity of someone who had had 13 years to process what happened that the report might be ignored. She had done it anyway, because the accurate record was the only thing she had access, and she had made it as accurate and specific and difficult to dismiss as she knew how to make it. The board had sealed it 3 weeks later. The chair who had signed the sealing order was a man named Whitmore, retired, 73 years old, living in Laramie. He was deposed in December. His testimony was not illuminating. He claimed not to remember the specific report, which was possible and possibly true, the plausible amnesia of a man who had signed many papers over many years and had learned to not look too hard at what was underneath them. But his signature was on the sealing order, and the sealing order was now part of the record, and the record was now part of a process that his ability to remember things could not alter. Vargas accepted a negotiated resolution in March. He did not go to trial. His counsel negotiated an agreement with the Attorney General's office that included a formal admission of misconduct in his role as Chief of Medical Staff, specifically the deliberate suppression of patient safety complaints and the approval of retaliatory personnel actions against clinical staff who had filed them. He surrendered his administrative certifications. He was barred from serving in any healthcare administrative capacity in Wyoming for 15 years. He paid a civil penalty that was significant enough to be punitive and insufficient to represent anything close to what the years of suppression had cost. It was not everything. Mara knew it wasn't everything. The 2 deaths that had been under review were ultimately classified as insufficiently causally linked to the documented suppression events to sustain a criminal charge. The chain of evidence was there in its outline, but not in its specifics. The gap between what was morally clear and what was legally provable functioning the way it always functioned, as a source of partial and imperfect justice rather than the complete version. She had been told this by Lund directly in a phone call in late January, and she had sat with it for several days before she finished sitting with it. Partial justice was still justice moving. She had learned that in different contexts, and it remained true in this one. Teresa Osi flew in from Portland for the final session of the state board hearing. Mara met her in the lobby of the health department, building a woman in her early 40s now, compact and precise in her movements, with the particular stillness of someone who had survived something and had organized themselves around the survival rather than the wound. She had dark eyes and a steady handshake, and she looked at Mara for a moment when they met with the gnawing aversion, reckonings of an experience they already knew intimately. "You wrote it down accurately," Teresa said. "Both times." "You did it 13 years ago," Mara said, "and it still took the building catching fire." Mara thought about that, about what it meant that the accurate record had existed for 13 years and had required an explosion and a mass casualty event and a retired admiral's 2 a.m. phone calls and a forensic extraction to become visible. About the specific cruelty of a system that could contain an accurate report for over a decade without acting on it. "It worked eventually," Mara said. "Eventually," Teresa repeated. Not bitterly, just precisely, yes. Together psychologically, professionally, and when it was done, they walked out of the building into a cold March afternoon. And Teresa said she was catching a flight back to Portland that evening. And Mara said she had to get back to the hospital. And they stood for a moment on the steps with the specific awkwardness of two people who have shared something significant and have not yet developed the language for it. "Are you going back to clinical practice?" Mara asked. Teresa looked at the street. "I've been thinking about it." A pause. Administration felt safer after Harlow. Less exposed. She looked at Mara. "But I think I was wrong about what safe meant." "It's hard to go back," Mara said. "Was it hard for you? Coming back to nursing after the military?" Mara thought about the 2 years at Harlow before the explosion. The sups, the suspension notice already prepared, the feeling of walking through a building that had decided what she was and had stopped looking at the evidence to the contrary. "Yes," she said, "but the work is still the work." Teresa nodded. They shook hands again. Teresa went to the airport. Mara went back to Crestfall. Sadie Wentworth was discharged from Harlow Memorial on a Thursday in November, 6 weeks after the explosion, which was faster than the surgical team had initially projected and slower than Sadie herself had wanted. She walked out under her own power, which had not been certain in the first 72 hours, and which remained one of the most significant data points in the whole of Mara's experience of that night. The Admiral came with her. He had been in Crestfall more than Portland in the weeks of his daughter's recovery present, in the way of a man who had learned, perhaps later than he should have. That proximity was not the same as involvement, and was working to close the gap between them. Mara had seen him twice in the corridors during that period, once at the nurse's station getting a patient update, once sitting in the family area with a book he was clearly not reading. He stopped her the morning of Sadie's discharge. "I have a question," he said. "Ask." "The reporting structure you described to Ellison. The escalation path that doesn't run through the attending. Have they moved on it?" "Size committee has a draft framework," Mara said. "It goes to the board next month." "Are you on the committee?" "I'm consulting." He looked at her with the assessing expression she had come to recognize. "That's not the same as leading it." "No," she said. "It's not. Is that your choice?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm better at the floor than the committee room. I know that about myself." "You did well enough in the conference room in October." "That was a different kind of room." She paused. "I'll stay on the committee as long as they need the clinical perspective."
"After that, I'll go back to the floor."
He nodded. Something in his face settled not approval exactly, but the recognition of a person who understood their own capacities and was not performing modesty about them. "Sadie wants to say goodbye," he said. She went to room 7 for the last time. Sadie was dressed and packed, sitting on the edge of the bed with the particular impatience of someone who has been still for 6 weeks and has run out of the resources needed to remain still. She looked up when Mara came in, and the expression on her face was different from The one she'd had in the dark of the ruined bay. Less frightened, more specific. The face of someone who had had 6 weeks to think about a night and had arrived at some conclusions. "You look better," Mara said. "I feel approximately 40% of normal," Sadie said, which is 40% more than I expected in October. She looked at Mara. "My dad told me about Holt." "The license." "Yes." "And Vargas." "Yes." Sadie was quiet for a moment. "The nurse in Portland." "Teresa." "My dad told me about her too, about the report she filed 13 years ago." "It was good documentation," Mara said. "It survived." "Because she wrote it carefully." "Yes." "Like you did." Sadie looked at her hands. "I've been thinking about that. About what it costs to do that, to write something accurately, and specifically when you know the system you're filing it into has every incentive to ignore it." She looked up. "What makes someone do that anyway?" Mara thought about Teresa at 29, sitting down with a clean sheet of paper and a pattern she had spent 19 months documenting. She thought about her own 952 notation, the specific language she had chosen, the second entry at 10:41 that she had written, knowing Holt had already dismissed her, and that the notation was, at that moment, the only thing she could still do. "You do it because the record matters even when the audience doesn't," she said. "Because accurate information has a longer life than the people trying to suppress it." She paused. "And because the patient is still the patient, regardless of what the institution is doing." Sadie held her gaze for a long moment. "I'm going back to school," she said. "Nursing school. I decided 3 weeks ago." A beat. I know it's not because of, I had been thinking about it before, actually. The highway crash happened on my way back from an information session." Mara looked at her. "That's what you were doing on the interstate," she said. "Yes." Sadie almost smiled. "My dad thinks it's because of you. I keep telling him it was already the direction I was heading." She paused. "But it's not nothing. What you did. You stayed present," Mara said, "in that bay. You kept answering me when I needed you to answer. That matters more than people understand. You told me. It kept people anchored." "It does." Sadie stood up. She was steadier than she'd been the last time Mara had seen her on her feet, the steadiness of someone whose body had done the long, quiet work of repair and was cautiously beginning to trust itself again. She put out her hand. Mara shook it. "Thank you," Sadie said. Not the reflexive thank you of an exit, the specific weighted kind. "Get well," Mara said. "Then go do the work." Sadie picked up her bag and walked out of room 7 and down the corridor toward her father, and Mara watched her go and then stood in the empty room for a moment with the particular feeling that arrived when something significant had passed through a space and left it changed in ways that were not immediately visible. Then she went back to the floor. The formal recognition came in February, 6 weeks before the Vargas resolution, which meant it arrived before everything was finished, and in that sense felt incomplete, the kind of acknowledgement that institutions, when they produced, when they understood something had happened and had not yet fully understood what it meant. Ellison presented it at a staff meeting, a formal reversal of both write-ups, a letter of commendation entered into her personnel file, and an invitation to consult on the new clinical reporting framework that Tsai's committee was building. The room applauded in the way of a room full of people who were tired and meant it anyway, and Mara stood at the front and felt the applause as a physical thing, as data about what the people in the room had experienced that night and in the weeks since, and she said thank you and meant that too. She did not make a speech. She had never been the kind of person who made speeches. She said that psychologically, professionally, that the work had been done by a lot of people, which was true, and that she hoped the structural changes would make sure that the next nurse who wrote something accurate in a chart would not have to come back through debris to defend it, which was the point, which was the thing that had been missing, which was the only version of this outcome that actually constituted progress rather than just consequence. Decker told her afterward that 3 people had cried. "Which 3?" she said. "I'm not telling you that," he said. She went back to the floor. Spring came to Crestfall the way it always came, late and unconvincing. The snow retreating from the parking lot in stages, the mountains north of town holding white on their upper faces, while the valley tried out green. Mara drove to work in the early mornings, when the light was still flat, and the roads were still cold, and the hospital appeared at the end of the county road, as it always appeared, functional, and a little worn, the east wing showing the repaired section in slightly newer brick that would take years to match the weathered face of the original. She noticed it every morning. She thought that was probably right. She thought that buildings should show what had happened to them, that the repair being visible was more honest than making it invisible. The first class of the new clinical reporting program ran in April. 12 nurses, 2 residents, 1 attending who had volunteered to be there, which was a small thing and not a small thing. Cy sat in for the first session and took notes, which Mara found more meaningful than the commendation letter, because the commendation letter was about the past, and Cy's notebook was about what came next. Mara taught from what she knew, which was the floor, the specific texture of the moment when a clinical concern met the institutional resistance that was supposed to prevent errors and instead sometimes created them. She talked about documentation as a practice rather than a formality, about the difference between writing something that recorded what happened and writing something that ensured what happened could not be revised. She talked about escalation paths and how to navigate them when they were obstructed, and she was honest about the fact that the paths were sometimes obstructed and that knowing that in advance was not discouraging, but practical. She did not talk about herself directly. She did not talk about Holt or the explosion or Sadie or the archive or any of the specific events that had brought the room into existence. The room already knew. Harlow was a building that had held all of it, and the people working inside it that carried the knowledge the way people carried everything that happened in the places where they worked as background, as context, as the thing underneath the daily surface that shaped the daily surface without announcing itself. At the end of the first session, a second-year resident named Garber stayed after the room cleared. He was 26, slightly awkward in the specific way of people who were intelligent enough to know what they didn't know yet and hadn't learned to carry that awareness without showing it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes. When you documented the concern at intake, both times, did you think it would matter?" Mara looked at him. She thought about the 952 entry, about the specific moment she had written it, knowing Holt had already dismissed her, knowing she was producing a record that nobody in the building had any immediate interest in reading. "I thought it might matter to the patient," she said. That was enough. He nodded slowly, working that through. "What if the patient hadn't made it?" he said. "What if Sadie Wentworth had died in that bay? Would the documentation still have mattered?" It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. "Yes," she said, "because someone else would have come after her, and the record would have been there." She held his gaze. "Documentation doesn't protect the patient you're writing about. It protects the patient you haven't met yet." Garber was quiet. Then he picked up his notebook and left. Mara stood in the empty room for a moment. Outside the windows, the parking lot was visible repaved. Since October, the debris long cleared, the triage tents long gone, the space looking like a hospital parking lot, and nothing else. The military vehicles were gone. The helicopters were gone. The compressed, specific crisis of that night had resolved into the ordinary morning landscape of a place that had gone back to its daily work. But the East Wing showed new brick, and the archive server in the administrative basement contained a complete forensic record of 9 cases spanning 26 months, plus 1 sealed report from 13 years prior, all of it intact, all of it preserved, all of it available to anyone who needed to understand what had happened here and how it had happened and what it cost. Teresa Osei was back in clinical practice. She had called Mara in March to say so, a short call, practical in its content, the kind of call 2 people made when they had established enough of a foundation to not require ceremony. She was working ER in Portland. She said it was harder than administration, and she was glad to be back. Sadie Wentworth started nursing school in September. Mara knew because the Admiral sent a single text, no message, just a photo of Sadie in front of a university building in her first week, squinting into the sun, looking exactly like a person who is exactly where they were supposed to be. Mara looked at the photo for a moment. Then she put her phone in her pocket and walked out of the empty classroom, her asswar, and back onto the floor where the day had already started, without her, where there were patients and charts and assessments and the daily, unfinished, imperfect work of keeping people alive. She picked up her first chart. She read it carefully. She wrote what she saw in specific, accurate language that could not be reinterpreted later by someone with a different agenda. That was the whole of it. That was what it had always been. Not the titles or the recognition or the formal reversal of paperwork, not the commendation letter or the commission or the satisfaction of watching a system finally do what systems were supposed to do. Those things mattered. She was not going to pretend they didn't matter. But they were the outcome of the work, not the reason for it. The reason was the same as it had always been. The reason was the patient in the bay who was stable until they weren't, who was talking until they stopped, who had a body that was telling the truth even when the institution around them was not. The reason was that someone had to read what the body was saying and write it down and refuse to let it be erased. Someone, when they were told to leave. Someone had to stay when they were told to leave. Someone had to come back through the smoke when the easiest and most defensible thing was to stand in the parking lot and wait for someone else to go in. Mara had learned, in the years before Harlow and the years inside it, that institutions were made of people before they were made of anything else, and that the people inside them carried either the instinct to protect the system or the instinct to protect the patient, and that these two instincts occasionally aligned and frequently did not, and that, in the moments when they didn't, the only thing that determined the outcome was which instinct the person in the room was willing to act on when acting on it cost something. She had paid the cost. She would pay it again. Not because it was painless, not because the system had treated her fairly, or the outcome had arrived cleanly, or the justice had been complete. None of those things were true, but because the patient was still the patient, and the work was still the work, and Mara Calloway had never needed the institution's permission to do it.